Okay, so in a minute, I'm going to be reading out loud from What is Marxism by Alan Woods and Rob Sewell. And until I start doing that, I'm going to be taking some notes on a workout program that I'm about to do. This is an example of part of my daily routine. I do some reading. I meditate on what I just read or listen to socialist audiobooks or podcasts with ideological framework. So then I practice yoga. I do Ashtanga yoga. Ideally the long version, but lately I've only been able to do the short version because I'm going out building up the Revolutionary Communists of America and building the party. I have to spend a lot of time out recruiting, flyering, tabling, selling newspapers and books. So I'll do 30 minutes meditation, 30 minutes yoga, and then 30 minutes martial arts, solo body weight drills and exercises. And right now I've got my little space heater going in the corner. The air conditioner behind me is turned off, and I've got the door almost all the way shut with a dehumidifier blowing in the direction of the door so that the floor doesn't get too slippery because I'll be sweating in here in about an hour. I'll be dripping on the ground, and it's a hardwood floor in here, so it'll be a little dangerous if I don't have the dehumidifier. So that's my situation. I encourage you to create your own daily routine of ideological struggle. Struggle with these ideas, learn these ideas about Marxism, Leninism, revolutionary concepts. Study anarchism, study socialism, study communism. I strongly recommend Marxist-Leninist communism. Anarchism will leave you isolated and easily picked off by the authorities in whatever oppressive regime you live under. But if you are a Marxist, if you are a communist, you have a party behind you. You have nation states backing you if you are a communist. So that's why I believe it's a better option than anarchism. But I have a lot of respect for my anarchist friends because my whole life up until recently, I've been an anarchist, I've been ideologically anarchist. But back to the thing, I'm going to be reading from this in a few minutes. Until then, I'm going to be writing out the workout routine that I'm going to get to, which is going to have a full body exercise, then a legs exercise, then a upper body, and then a core exercise. And today I'm just going to be doing technique stuff with my partner. But when I do my personal workout, I'm going to be doing a technique round and then a body weight exercise round, which will include like a full body burpee, and then squats, then push-ups, then sit-ups, or some variation of that. So this live stream is going to show me writing out my workout plan for today, 10/27/25. The takedown technique is Sasai Surikomiyoshi. It's a foot sweep. That's what I'm going to be working on with my partner when we train together later, Tatiana, and in my solo drills. So I write out the technique. Sasai is what I'm going to be working on. I'm going to look up a kickboxing combo. We're going to work on body coordination 1, which is cross jab cross, rear leg kick. Right? Very simple. So that's the striking combination. I'm going to divide my little page here into 4 quadrants. One for upper body, one for full body, one for legs, one for upper body, one for core. We're going to do body coordination 1 for the striking, followed by similar kicks and boxing in the round after that, following the same pattern as the body coordination, And then for the core exercise, we're going to do high knees because last time I did head movement. Well, actually, we're going to do head movement again because the most important thing is don't get hit. Because one bad hit can knock you out. And then full body burpee. In round 2, full body burpee. For legs, let's see. For legs, we're just going to do wide squats. Basic warm-up. And then we're going to do narrow push-ups. And for core, we're going to do the oblique crunch standing because it relates to the head movement of the previous round. Then for the takedown, we're going to practice this Sasai Surikomiyoshi, which is a foot sweep. If you want to see what it is, then stay tuned in until I get to the workout at the very end. But for those who just tuned in, I'm going to be writing out my workout here, which I'll share with my partner, and we'll work out together after I'm done here so I can help them. Then I'm going to read from this book, and then I'm going to meditate listening to audiobooks by Lenin. Then I will do yoga and martial arts while continuing to listen to Lenin. So for the legs, we're going to do the foot sweep drill for Sasai Surikomiyoshi, which is very simple. For upper body, we're going to do the upper body wheel turning movement that you do when you throw or trip somebody with Sasai Surikomiyoshi. And we're also going to work on some pummeling and some arm drag drills while we do this upper body. And for the core exercise, let's see. That's tough because a core exercise for this one isn't easy to find. And I'm looking for stuff that my partner can do. We're going to do a posture exercise for the core. So this is going to be relatively easy because I'm developing a practice that my partner can do. But objectively it's difficult because I'm going to go hard when I do it. Next is full body burpee for round 3. Full body exercise. I'm going to put on some chill music in the background. So, for the leg exercise, we're going to do narrow squats. And then we're going to do wide push-ups. And then we're going to do sit-ups. So for my martial arts routine, I do a striking round of solo drills, kickboxing, then I do a takedown round, then I do leg locks and arm locks round. So we're going to do this combo of body coordination 1 with the takedown leading into arm locks and leg locks. For the legs, we're going to do leg lock entry from standing. For upper body, we're going to do push-up to armbar. And for core, we're going to do armbar sit-ups. From knee on belly. Round 5, full body burpee. For leg exercises, again, I want to keep it easy for my partner. So we're going to do calf raises. Oh, they're not going to be practicing this actually. They're just doing the technique rounds with me. So let's see. I will do calf raises because I already started to write it. But because I'm going easy on the legs, I'm going to do handstand push-ups. Against the wall for now, until I can do them without it. And then for the core, let's see. I'm going to do leg lifts. Lifting up my legs while laying on the back. So for the martial arts, I did a striking round, I did a takedown round, I did a arm locks and leg locks round of solo drills, and I'll do a round of solo drills related to strangleholds. So from standing, I'm going to practice sprawling to guillotine and back takes. For the legs, I'm going to practice the triangle squeeze. Should be done every day if you're a martial artist, if you're a grappler. For upper body, working on strangleholds, I'm going to do push-up to knee on belly to triangle on the top, which I just call triangle push-ups. And these things will only make sense if you're a grappler, if you've practiced grappling with other people. If you want to be an effective martial artist, if you want to be an effective revolutionary, a good communist, a good Bolshevik, whatever you want to call it, you have to practice martial arts. You have to train with other people and sweat and struggle with each other to get stronger as a communist, as a Marxist, as a martial artist who is a political revolutionary. You have to train your body. So sitting here, I'm about to train my mind. I'm going to read out loud from this. I'm going to sit and meditate quietly while I listen to Lenin, and then I'm going to do yoga, stretch my body, warm up for this difficult workout, and then later I'm going to train with my partner. I'm going to train with some comrades throughout the week, and I encourage you to do the same thing. If you're in Tallahassee, Florida, please like, share, subscribe. Join me if you're around the world. Please like, share, and subscribe and practice along with me online. So, the core exercise for today for the submissions for strangleholds. Let's see. I'm going to do triangles from the back, I believe. Actually, what I'm going to do is the hip bump, sit up to guillotine. Because I don't do it very often. Now, back to the full body burpee round. I'm writing out the workout that I'm about to do and share with my partner after I live stream. I'm going to do this and demonstrate it on the live stream like I always do. Afterwards, I'm going to work out with my partner and hopefully some comrades later tonight. For core exercise, let's see. I'm going to do one-legged squats. Because why not? And then I'll do one-hand push-ups. And this will be getting into the harder part of the workout. Then for the core exercise, let's see if there's anything I haven't done lately. I haven't done the bicycle exercise lately from the back. Then back to the grappling, I'm going to do break, fall, stand up. I'm going to do break, fall, stand up without the hands for the leg round. For the upper body, I'm going to do some kind of leg drag exercise. There's a few of them. You can do leg drags on your back, leg drags on your belly where you're pulling yourself along, on your forearms or on your hands. When you do it belly down on your hands, dragging your body without your legs, it's called a seal, and I haven't done that lately, so I should probably do that one. Even though it looks silly, it's necessary to be able to move your whole body, but also isolate your body parts and practice each one, each region. So for the core, we're going to do bridge and shrimp and sideways scoots. Actually, I'm just going to do regular leg drags for the upper body, so my partner can do that. Alright, full body burpee, and review. And that'll be it for today's workout. So for those following along, this is the previous workouts throughout the week. This is what we're doing today. If you take a screenshot and then flip the image around, you'll be able to see the exercises and follow along. And right now I'm going to read from What is Marxism before I sit and meditate on these ideas. And then we will listen to Lenin while we sit and meditate, do yoga, and then these martial arts exercises, so that your mind is active and listening and learning while we are training and making savage the body, as Mao says. So it's almost 2 o'clock. We'll be done around 4. And I'm going to go meet with a comrade around 5 o'clock to discuss these revolutionary ideas that I'm about to read. Why the barbarians triumphed. By the time the barbarians invaded, the whole structure of the Roman Empire was on the verge of collapse, not only economically, but morally and spiritually. No wonder the barbarians were welcomed as liberators by the slaves and the poorer sections of society. They merely completed a job that had been well prepared in advance. The barbarian attacks were a historical accident that served to express a historical necessity. The whole system was already undermined by the decay of the slave economy and the monstrously oppressive nature of the empire, with its bloated bureaucracy and predatory tax farmers. There was a steady drift of the population to the countryside, where the basis was already being laid for the development of a different mode of production, feudalism. The barbarians merely delivered a coup de grace to a rotten and moribund system. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels wrote, "Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight. A fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes." What happened to the Roman Empire is a striking illustration of the last named variant. The failure of the oppressed classes of Roman society to unite to overthrow the brutally exploitative slave state led to an inner exhaustion and a long and painful period of social, economic, and cultural decay, which prepared the way for the barbarians. Once the empire reached its limits, the contradictions inherent in slavery began to assert themselves. Rome entered into a long period of decline that lasted for centuries, until it was eventually overrun by the barbarians, beginning with the Goths. First Greece, then Italy were plundered and ravaged. Finally, for the first time in 6 centuries, on 24 August 410 Common Era, Rome was sacked by the Visigoths led by their king, Alaric I. This was only the beginning. After the Visigoths and Ostrogoths came the Vandals, Alans, Lombards, Suevi, Alemanni, Burgundians, Franks, Thuringians, Frisians, Heruli, Gepidi, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, Huns, and Magyars. They crashed their way across the frontiers in successive waves. When the Vandals conquered the African provinces in the 5th century Common Era, Rome's food supply was suddenly interrupted, dealing a mortal blow to the Western Empire. The immediate effect of the barbarian onslaught was to wipe out civilization and throw society and humanity thought back for 1,000 years. The productive forces suffered a violent interruption. The cities were destroyed or abandoned. The invaders were an agricultural people and knew nothing of towns and cities. The barbarians, in general, were hostile to the towns and their inhabitants, a psychology that is quite common among peasants in all periods. This process of devastation, rape, and pillage was to continue for centuries, leaving behind a terrible heritage of backwardness, which we call the Dark Ages. Yet although the barbarians succeeded in conquering the Romans, they themselves were fairly quickly absorbed, and even lost their own language, and ended up speaking a dialect of Latin. Thus the Franks, who gave their name to modern France, or a Germanic tribe speaking a language related to modern German. The same thing happened to the Germanic tribes that invaded Spain and Italy. This is what normally happens when a more economically and culturally backward people conquers a more advanced nation. Exactly the same thing happened later to the Mongol hordes that conquered India. They were absorbed by the more advanced Hindu culture and ended up founding a new Indian dynasty, the Mughals. Feudalism. The rise of the feudal system following the collapse of Rome was accompanied by a long period of cultural stagnation in all of Europe, north of the Pyrenees, with the exception of two inventions, the water wheel and the windmill. There were no real inventions for about over 1,000 years. 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, the only decent roads in Europe were Roman roads. In other words, there was a complete eclipse of culture. This was a result of the collapse of the productive forces, upon which culture ultimately depends. That is what we mean by a descending line in history, and let nobody imagine that such a thing cannot recur. The barbarian invasions, wars, and plagues that meant that progress was punctuated with long periods of retrogression. I'll read that again. The barbarian invasions, wars, and plagues meant that progress was punctuated with periods of retrogression. But eventually the chaotic conditions that coincided with the fall of Rome were replaced by a new equilibrium, feudalism. The decline of the Roman Empire caused a sharp falling off of urban life throughout most of Europe. The barbarian invaders were generally absorbed, and by the 10th century, Europe entered slowly into a new period of ascent. Of course, this statement is relative in character. Culture did not regain comparable levels to those of antiquity until the beginning of the Renaissance in the late 14th and 15th centuries. Learning and science were strictly subordinated to the authority of the church. Men's energies were absorbed either in constant warfare or monastic dreams, but gradually the downward spiral came to an end and was replaced by a long upward slope. The closing of avenues of communication led to a collapse of trade. The money economy was undermined and increasingly replaced by barter. In place of integrated international economy of the slave system under the empire, we had the proliferation of small, isolated agricultural communities. The basis of feudalism was already laid in Roman society, when the slaves were freed and turned into coloni, tied to the land, who later became serfs. This process, which occurred at different times, assuming different forms in different countries, was accelerated by the barbarian conquests. The Germanic warlords became the lords of the conquered lands and their inhabitants, offering military protection and a degree of security in exchange for the exploitation of the labor of the serfs. In the early period of feudalism, the atomization of the nobility allowed relatively strong monarchies, but later the royal power found itself confronted with strong estates capable of challenging it and overthrowing it. The barons had their own feudal armies, which they frequently led into the field against each other and also against the king. The feudal system in Europe was mainly a decentralized system. The power of the monarchy was limited by the aristocracy. The central power was usually weak. The center of gravity of the feudal lord, his power base, was his manor and estate. The state power was weak and the bureaucracy non-existent. This weakness of the center was what later permitted the independence of the towns, royal charters, and the emergence of the bourgeoisie as a separate class. The romantic idealization of the Middle Ages is based on a myth. This was a bloody and convulsive period characterized by great cruelty and barbarism, and what Marx and Engels called a brutal display of vigor. The Crusades were characterized by unusual viciousness and inhumanity. The German invasions of Italy were exercises in futility. For more than 100 years, England and France were engaged in a bloody war that reduced large parts of France to ruin. The Battle of Agnicourt in 1415 was the last and bloodiest battle of the Middle Ages. Here, in essence, two rival systems were pitted against each other on the battlefield. The old feudal military order, based on the nobility and the idea of chivalry and service, clashed with the new mercenary army based on wage labor. The French nobility was decimated, defeated shamefully by an army of mercenary commoners. In the first 90 minutes, 8,000 of the flower of the French aristocracy were butchered and 1,200 taken prisoner. At the end of the day, not only the whole of the French nobility lay dead and bleeding on the battlefield, but the feudal order itself. This had important social and political consequences. From this moment, the French nobility's grip on power began to weaken. When the English were driven from France, it was by an uprising of the people led by a peasant girl, Joan of Arc. Amid the wreckage of their lives, the chaos and bloodshed, the French people became conscious of their national identity and acted accordingly. The bourgeoisie began to demand their rights and charters, and a new central monarchical power, leaning on the bourgeoisie and the people, began to seize the reins of power, forging a national state out of which modern France finally emerged. The Black Death. When a given socioeconomic system enters into crisis and decline, this is reflected not only in the stagnation of the productive forces, but stagnation at every level. The decline of feudalism was an epoch when intellectual life was dead or dying. The dead hand of the church paralyzed all cultural and scientific initiatives. The feudal structure was based on a pyramid in which God and the king stood at the top of a complex hierarchy, each segment of which was linked to the unders by the so-called duties. In theory, the feudal lords protected the peasants, who in turn put food on their tables and clothes on their backs, fed and enabled them to live a life of luxury and idleness. The priests prayed for their soul, the knights defended them, and so on. This system lasted a very long time. In Europe, it lasted approximately 1,000 years, from about the middle of the 5th to the middle of the 15th centuries. But by the 13th century, feudalism in England and other countries was already reaching its limits. The growth in population put the whole system under colossal strain. Marginal lands had to be brought under cultivation, and much of the population merely eked out a bare living at the level of subsistence on small plots of land. It was an edge of chaos situation, where the whole unsound edifice could be brought crashing down by a sufficiently powerful external shock. And what shock could be more powerful than this? The ravages of the Black Death, which killed off between 1/3 and half of the population of Europe, served to throw into sharp relief the injustice and misery, ignorance, and intellectual and spiritual darkness of the 14th century. It is now generally accepted that the Black Death played an important role in undermining feudalism. This was particularly clear in the case of England. Having already ravaged through Europe, the plague spread to England in the summer of 1348. As the plague spread inland to the villages of rural England, the population was decimated. Whole families, sometimes whole villages, were wiped out. As on the European mainland, about half the population perished. Although those who managed to survive frequently found themselves in possession of quite large amounts of land, a new class of rich peasants was being created. The colossal loss of life led to an extreme shortage of labor. These were simply not enough laborers to gather in the harvest or artisans to perform all other necessary functions. This laid the basis for a profound social transformation. So the strength of workers comes from withholding labor, or when there isn't enough labor available, like during the COVID-19 pandemic. Feeling their strength, the peasants demanded and got higher wages and lower rents. If the lords refused to meet their demands, they could always leave and go to another master who was willing to do so. Some villages were abandoned altogether. And you see this in America today, where people job hop in order to get a raise because bosses aren't paying a living wage. The old bonds were first loosened and then broken. As the peasants threw off the yoke of feudal obligations, many flocked to the towns to seek their fortune. This in turn led to a further development of the towns, and therefore furthered the rise of the bourgeoisie. In 1349, King Edward III passed what was possibly the first wages policy in history, the Ordinance of Laborers. This decreed that wages must be held at the old levels, but the law was a dead letter from the start. The laws of supply and demand were already stronger than any royal decree. Already there was a new spirit of rebelliousness. The old authority was already undermined and discredited. The whole rotten edifice was tottering for a fall. One good push, it seemed, would finish it. In France, there were a whole series of peasant uprisings, known as jacqueries. Even more serious was the 1381 peasant rising in England, when the rebels occupied London and for a time had the king in their power, but ultimately these risings could not succeed. These uprisings were just premature anticipations of the bourgeois revolution at a time when the conditions for this had not completely matured. They expressed the dead end of feudalism and the dead discontent of the masses, but they could not show a way out. As a result, the feudal system, although substantially modified, survived for a period, manifesting all the symptoms of a diseased and declining social order. The last period of the Middle Ages was a troubled time, characterized by continuous convulsions, wars and civil wars, just like our own times. The feeling that the end of the world is nigh is common to every historical period when a particular socio-economic system has entered into irreversible decline. This was the period when large numbers of men took to the roads, barefoot and dressed in penitential rags, flogging themselves till they bled. The flagellant sects awaited the end of the world, which they anxiously expected from one hour to the next. For those who don't know, the flagellant sects are sects or groups of sectarian people who would beat themselves over the back with whips until they bled, and that was called a flagellate, right? At the end, what occurred was not the end of the world, but only the end of feudalism. And what arrived was not the new millennium, but only the capitalist system. But they could not be expected to understand this. One thing was clear to all. The old world was in a state of rapid and irredeemable decay. Men and women were torn by contradictory tendencies. Their beliefs were shattered, and they were cut adrift in a cold, inhumane, hostile, and incomprehensible world. The rise of the bourgeoisie. When all the old certainties were overthrown, it was as if the linchpin of the world had been removed. The result was terrifying turbulence and uncertainty. By the middle of the 15th century, the old system of beliefs began to unravel. People no longer looked to the church to provide salvation, comfort, and solace. Instead, religious dissension arose in many different forms and served as a guise for social and political opposition. Peasants were defying the old laws and restrictions, demanding freedom of movement and asserting it by migrating to the towns without a license. Contemporary chronicles express the irritation of the lords at the unwillingness of the laborers to take order. There were even some strikes. Amidst all this darkness, new forces were stirring, announcing the birth of a new power and a new civilization that was gradually growing up inside the womb of the old society. The rise of trade in the towns brought with it a new aspiring class, the bourgeoisie, which began to jostle for position and power with the feudal ruling classes, the nobility, and the church. The birth of a new society was announced in art and literature, where new trends began to emerge in the course of the next 100 years. The rise of the towns those islands of capitalism in a sea of feudalism, was gradually undermining the old order. The new money economy, appearing at the margins of society, was gnawing at the foundation of feudal economy. The old feudal restrictions were now unbearable impositions, intolerable barriers to progress. They had to be shattered, and they were shattered. But the victory of the bourgeoisie did not come all at once. A long period was required for it to gain a final victory over the old order. Only gradually did a new spark of life reappear in the towns. The slow recovery of trade led to the rise of the bourgeoisie and the revival of the towns, notably in Flanders, Holland, and northern Italy. New ideas began to appear. After the Fourth Crusade and the sack of Constantinople in 1204, there was a new interest in the ideas and art of classical antiquity. New forms of art appeared in Italy and the Netherlands. Forgive me if I mispronounce this. Boccaccio's Decameron may be considered as the first modern novel. In England, the writings of Chaucer are full of life and color, reflecting a new spirit in art. The Renaissance was taking its first hesitant steps. Gradually, out of chaos, a new order was arising. The Reformation. By the 15th century, the bourgeoisie was well established in Europe. The Netherlands became the factory of Europe, and trade flourished along the Rhine. The cities of northern Italy were a powerful locomotive of economic growth and commerce, opening up trade with the East. From about the 5th to the 12th centuries, Europe consisted of largely isolated economies. No longer. The discovery of America, the rounding of the Cape, and the general expansion of trade gave a fresh impetus, not only to the creation of wealth, but to the development of men's minds. Under such conditions, the old intellectual stagnation was no longer possible. The ground was cut from under the feet of the conservatives and the reactionaries, as Marx and Engels explained in the Communist Manifesto. The discovery of America, the rounding of the Cape, opening up fresh ground for the rise of the bourgeoisie. The East Indian and Chinese markets, the colonization of America, trade with the colonies, the increase in the means of exchange and in commodities generally gave to commerce, to navigation, to industry, an impulse never before known, and thereby to the revolutionary element in the tottering feudal society, a rapid development. It is no coincidence that the rise of the bourgeoisie in Italy, Holland, England, and later in France was accompanied by an extraordinary flourishing of culture, art, and science. Revolutions, as Marx once said, are the locomotives of history. In countries where the bourgeois revolution triumphed in the 17th and 18th centuries, the development of productive forces and technology was complemented by a parallel development of science and philosophy, which undermined the ideological dominion of the church forever. In the epoch of the rise of the bourgeoisie, when capitalism still represented a progressive force in history, the first ideologists of that class had to fight a hard battle against the ideological bastions of feudalism, starting with the Catholic Church. Long before destroying the power of feudal landlords, the bourgeoisie had to break down the philosophical and religious defenses mounted to protect the feudal system around the church and its militant arm, the Inquisition. This revolution was anticipated by the revolt of Martin Luther against the authority of the church. During the 14th and 15th centuries, Germany saw a move from an entirely agrarian economy and the rise of a new social classes that clashed with the traditional feudal hierarchy. Luther's attacks on the Roman Catholic Church acted as the spark that ignited a revolution. The burghers and lesser nobility sought to break the power of the clergy, escape the clutches of Rome, and last but not least, enrich themselves through the confiscation of church property. But in the depths of feudal society, other more elemental forces were stirring. When Luther's appeals against the clergy and ideas about Christian freedom reached the ears of the German peasants, they acted as a powerful stimulus to the repressed rage of the masses, who had long suffered in silence the opposition of the feudal lords. Now they rose up to extract a terrible vengeance upon all their oppressors. Beginning in 1524, the Peasants' War spread across the Germanic regions of the Holy Roman Empire during 1525 until its suppression in 1526. What happened after this has been repeated frequently in subsequent history. When confronted with the consequences of his revolutionary ideas, Luther had to choose a side, and he joined with the burghers, nobility, and princes in crushing the peasants. The peasants found a better leader in the person of Thomas Müntzer. When Luther preached peaceful resistance, Thomas Müntzer attacked the priesthood in violent sermons, calling for the people to rise up in arms. Like Luther, he quoted biblical references to justify his actions. Does not Christ say, "I came not to send peace, but a sword"? The most radical wing of the movement were the Anabaptists, who were already beginning to question private property, taking as their model the primitive communism of the early Christians described in the Acts of Apostle. Müntzer maintained that the Bible was not infallible and that the Holy Spirit had ways of communicating directly through the gift of reason. Luther was horrified and wrote the notorious pamphlet against the murderous, thieving hordes of peasants. Oh, what an asshole. The revolt was crushed with unspeakable barbarity, which set Germany back for centuries. But the tide of bourgeois revolt that was reflected in the rise of Protestantism was now unstoppable. Those lands where the reactionary feudal forces quelled by the embryo of the new society before birth were sentenced to the nightmare of a long and inglorious period of degeneration, decline, and decay. The example of Spain is the most graphic in this regard. The bourgeois revolution. The first bourgeois revolution took the form of a national revolt of the Netherlands against the oppressive rule of Catholic Spain. In order to succeed, the wealthy Dutch burghers leaned on the men of no property, those courageous desperados, drawn mainly from the poorest layers of society. The shock troops of the Dutch Revolution were known contemptuously by their enemies as the Sea of Beggars. This description was not altogether inaccurate. They were poor artisans, laborers, fishermen, homeless and dispossessed people, all those regarded as the dregs of society. But, fired up with Calvinist fanaticism, they inflicted one defeat after another on the forces of mighty Spain. It was this that laid the basis for the rise of the Dutch Republic and a modern, prosperous bourgeois Holland. The next episode in the bourgeois revolution was even more significant and far-reaching in its implications. The English Revolution of the 17th century assumed the form of civil war. It expressed itself as dual power, the royal power resting upon the privileged classes or the upper circles of those classes, the aristocrats and bishops based in Oxford, were confronted by the bourgeoisie and the small landowners and plebeian masses based around London. The English Revolution only succeeded when Oliver Cromwell, basing himself on the most radical elements, that is, the armed plebeians, swept the bourgeois to one side and waged a revolutionary war against the royalists. As a result, King Charles I was captured and executed. The conflict ended with a purging of the Parliament and the dictatorship of Cromwell. The lower ranks of the army, under the leadership of the Levelers, the extreme left of the revolution, tried to carry the revolution further, questioning private property, but were crushed by Cromwell. The reason for this defeat must be found in the objective conditions of the period. Industry had not yet developed to the point where it could provide the basis for socialism. The proletariat itself remained at an embryonic stage of development. The levelers themselves represented the lower levels of the petty bourgeois, and therefore, despite all of their heroism, were unable to have their own individual historic path. After Cromwell's death, the bourgeoisie reached a compromise with Charles II that enabled it to hold real power while maintaining the monarchy as a bulwark against any further revolutions against private property. This compromise would last until Charles's heir, James II, was replaced by a more compliant dynasty in a coup, the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, led by the Dutch adventurer William of Orange. The American Revolution, which took the form of a war of independence, only succeeded to the degree that it involved the mass of poor farmers who waged a successful guerrilla war against the army of King George III of England. The French Revolution of 1789 to 93 was on a far higher level than the English Revolution. This was one of the greatest events in human history. Even today, it is an endless source of inspiration. And whereas Cromwell fought under the banner of religion, the French bourgeois raised the banner of reason. Even before it brought down the formidable wall of the Bastille, it had brought down the invisible but no less formidable walls of the church and religion. At every stage, the motor force that drove the French Revolution forward, sweeping aside all obstacles, was the active participation of the masses. And when this active participation of the masses ebbed, the revolution came to a full stop and went into reverse. That was what led directly to reaction. Firstly, of the Thermidorian and later of the Bonapartist variety. The enemies of the French Revolution always try to blacken its image with the accusations of violence and bloodshed. As a matter of fact, the violence of the masses is inevitably a reaction against the violence of the old ruling class. The origins of the terror must be sought in the reaction of the revolution to the threat of violent overthrow from both internal and external enemies. The revolutionary dictatorship was the result of revolutionary war and was only an expression of the latter. Under the rule of Maximilien Robespierre and the Jacobins, the semi-proletarian sans-culottes, forgive my pronunciation, carried the revolution to a successful conclusion. In fact, the masses pushed the leaders to go far further than they intended. Objectively, the revolution was bourgeois democratic in character, since the development of the productive forces in the proletariat had not yet reached a point where the question of socialism could be posed. At a certain point, the process, having reached its limits, had to go into reverse. Robespierre and his faction struck down the left wing and were then cut down themselves. The Thermidorian reactionaries in France hunted and oppressed the Jacobins, while the masses, worn out by years of exertion and sacrifice, had begun to fall into passivity and indifference. The pendulum now swung sharply to the right, but it did not restore the ancient regime. The fundamental socioeconomic gains of the revolution remained. The power of the landed aristocracy was broken. The rotten and corrupt directory was followed by the equally rotten and corrupt personal dictatorship of Napoleon Bonaparte. The French bourgeoisie were terrified of the Jacobins and the sans-culottes with their egalitarian and leveling tendencies. But it was even more terrified by the threat of the royalist counter-revolution, which would drive it from power and put the clock back to pre-1789. The wars continued, and there were still internal revolts by reactionaries. The only way out was to reintroduce dictatorship, but in the form of military rule. The bourgeoisie was looking for a savior and found one in the form of Napoleon Bonaparte. With the defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, the last flickering embers of the fires lit by revolutionary France were extinguished. A long gray period settled down on Europe like a thick coat of suffocating dust. The forces of triumphant reaction seemed firmly in the saddle. But that was only an appearance. Beneath the surface, the mole of revolution was busy digging the foundations for a new revolution. The victory of capitalism in Europe laid the basis for a colossal spawning of industry, and with it, the strengthening of that class that is destined to overthrow capitalism and usher in a new and higher stage of social development, socialism. Marx and Engels wrote in the Communist Manifesto, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals, and the German police spies. These words describe the reactionary system that was established by the Congress of Vienna. Following the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, it was intended to eliminate the risk of revolution, to exorcise the specter of the French Revolution forever. The brutal dictatorship of the powers of old Europe seemed as if it would last forever, but sooner or later things would turn into their opposite. Beneath the surface of reaction, new forces were gradually maturing, and a new revolutionary class, the proletariat, was stretching its limbs. The counter-revolution was overthrown by a new revolutionary wave that swept over Europe in 1848. These revolutions were fought under the banner of democracy, the same banner that was raised over the barricades of Paris in 1789. But everywhere, the leading force of the revolution was not the cowardly reactionary bourgeoisie, but the lineal descendants of the French sans-culottes, the working class, which inscribed on its banner a new kind of revolutionary ideal, the ideal of communism. The revolutions of 1848 to 1849 were defeated through the cowardice and treachery of the bourgeoisie and its liberal representatives. Reaction ruled once more until 1871, when the heroic proletariat of France stormed heaven in the Paris Commune, the first time in history that the working class overthrew the old bourgeois state and began to create a new kind of state, a workers' state. That glorious episode lasted only a few months and was finally drowned in blood, but it left a lasting heritage and laid the basis for the Russian Revolution of 1917. I wanted to stop now, but I consider the Russian Revolution to be the greatest event in history, so I'm going to read a little more. The Russian Revolution. For Marxists, the October Revolution of 1917 was the greatest single event in human history. Under the leadership of the Bolshevik Party of Lenin and Trotsky, the working class succeeded in overthrowing its oppressors and at least began the task of the socialist transformation of society. However, the revolution took place not in an advanced capitalist country, as Marx had expected, but on the basis of the most frightful backwardness. To give an approximate idea of the conditions that confronted the Bolsheviks, in just 1 year, 1920, 6 million people starved to death in Soviet Russia. Marx and Engels explained long ago that communism, a classless society, requires the right material conditions in order to exist. The first stage of communism is often referred to as socialism. The starting point of socialism must be a higher point of development of the productive forces than the most advanced capitalist society, the US, for existence. Only on the basis of a highly developed industry, agriculture, science, and technology, is it possible to guarantee the conditions for the free development of human beings, starting with a drastic reduction in the working day. The prior conditions for this is the participation of the working class in the democratic control and administration of society. As Marx states, between capitalist and communist society lies the period of the revolutionary transformation of the one into the other. Corresponding to this is also a political transition period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. As all the greatest Marxist theoreticians explained, the task of the socialist revolution is to bring the working class to power by smashing the old capitalist state machine. The latter was the repressive organ designed to keep the working class in subjection. Marx explained that the capitalist state, together with its state bureaucracy, cannot serve the interests of the new power. It has to be done away with. However, the new state created by the working class would be different from all previous states in history. Engels described it as a semi-state, a state designed in such a way that it was destined to disappear. Engels long ago explained that in any ancient society in which art, science, and government is the monopoly of a minority, that minority will use and abuse its position in its own interests. Lenin was quick to see the danger of the bureaucratic degeneration of the revolution in conditions of general backwardness. In State and Revolution, written in 1917, he worked out a program on the basis of the experience of the Paris Commune. Here he explains the basic conditions, not for socialism or communism, but for the first period after the revolution, the transitional period between capitalism and socialism. These were 1. The democratic and free elections and the right of recall for all officials. 2. No official to receive a wage higher than a skilled worker. 3. No standing army but the armed people. 4. Gradually, all the administrative tasks are to be done in turn by all, so that all may become bureaucrats for a time, and that therefore nobody may be able to become a bureaucrat. I saw this in Rojava. It's a really nice system. This is a Finnish program for workers' democracy. It is directly aimed against the danger of bureaucracy. This in turn formed the basis of the 1919 Bolshevik Party program. In other words, contrary to the calumnies of the enemies of socialism, Soviet Russia in the time of Lenin and Trotsky was the most democratic regime in history. However, the regime of Soviet workers' democracy established by the October Revolution did not survive. By the early 1930s, all of the above points had been abolished. Under Stalin, the workers' state suffered a process of bureaucratic degeneration, which ended in the establishment of a monstrous totalitarian regime and the physical annihilation of the Leninist party. The decisive factor in the Stalinist political counter-revolution in Russia was the isolation of the revolution in a backward country. The way in which this political counter-revolution took place was explained by Trotsky in The Revolution Betrayed. It is not feasible for society to jump straight from capitalism to a classless society. The material and cultural inheritance of capitalist society is far too inadequate for that. There is too much scarcity and inequality that cannot immediately be overcome. After the socialist revolution, there must be a transitional period that will prepare the necessary ground for superabundance in a classless society. Marx called the first stage of the new society the first phase, as opposed to the higher phase of communist society, where the last residue of material inequality would disappear. In that sense, socialism and communism have been contrasted to the lower and higher stages of the new society. In describing the lower stage of communism, Marx writes, "What we are dealing with here is a communist society, not as it has developed on its own foundations, but on the contrary, just as it emerges from capitalist society, which is thus, in every respect, economically, morally, and intellectually, still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it emerges." However, for Marx, this is a crucial point. This lower stage of communism from its very beginning could be on a higher level in terms of its economic development than the most developed and advanced capitalism. And why is this so important? Because without a massive development of the productive forces, scarcity would prevail, and with it the struggle for existence. As Marx and Engels explained, such a state of affairs would pose the danger of degeneration. The development of productive forces is also an absolutely necessary practical prerequisite of communism, because without it, only privation, want would be generalized, and with want, the struggle over the necessities would also begin again, and all the old shit would necessarily be restored. These prophetic words of Marx explain why the Russian Revolution, as full of promise, ended in bureaucratic degeneration and the monstrous totalitarian caricature of Stalinism, which in turn prepared the way for capitalist restoration and further regression. All the old shit revived because the Russian Revolution was isolated in conditions of frightful material and cultural backwardness. But today, with the tremendous advance in science and technique, the conditions have been prepared whereby this would no longer be the case. And I will stop reading for there. If you are a communist, please check out the Revolutionary Communists of America. Go to communistusa.org/join. And please like, share, and subscribe to this channel and also the Revolutionary Communists of America and the Revolutionary Communist International. Right now, what I'm going to do is get ready to sit and meditate on these thoughts and on an audiobook of Lenin. And then after I meditate, I will practice yoga and then martial arts. After I'm done doing the martial arts, I'm going to go meet with a comrade who I am recruiting for the Revolutionary Communists of America. And after that, I'll be training with another comrade who is my life partner. Speaking of which, I need to put my ring back on. So we just finished What is to be Done in 1902. Now we're listening to the national question in our program in 1903.
Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the April 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of the national question in our program by Lenin from 1903. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and we don't run ads on this channel, so please consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to the Patreon in the video description. So this work was published in Iskra, the Spark, Lenin's newspaper, issue number 44, July 15, 1903, published according to the Iskra text. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1964, volume 6. HTML transcription and markup by R. Simbala and D. Walters. It's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive, which is part of the Marxists Internet Archive, at marxists.org. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. So, by way of introduction, 1903 was still a couple of years out from the first Russian Revolution. Russian Marxists were trying their best to get organized, to differentiate themselves from other sort of left-ish political trends. I mean, many people were opposed to the Tsarist regime, which was incredibly oppressive. Many people recognized that there were, at a minimum, many reforms that needed to be done, but different parties, different groups had different visions. Lenin was an outstanding advocate of his party's positions and a relentless critic of positions that he opposed. So in this piece, Lenin's going to be talking about the draft party program with respect to the national question. National identity, national liberation, national oppression, etc. Let's begin the text. In our draft party program, we have advanced the demand for a republic with a democratic constitution that would guarantee, among other things, quote, recognition of the right to self-determination for all nations forming part of the state, unquote. Many did not find this demand in our program sufficiently clear, and in issue number 33, in speaking about the manifesto of the Armenian Social Democrats, we explained the meaning of this point in the following way. The Social Democrats, which comment, at this time Social Democrat just meant Marxist, basically. It didn't have today's connotation of like reformist, welfare capitalist. That split would come later. Continuing. The Social Democrats will always combat every attempt to influence national self-determination from without by violence or by any injustice. However, our unreserved recognition of the struggle for freedom of self-determination does not in any way commit us to supporting every demand for national self-determination. As the party of the proletariat, the Social Democratic Party considers to be its positive and principal task to further the self-determination of the proletariat in each nationality, rather than that of peoples or nations. We must always and unreservedly work for the very closest unity of the proletariat of all nationalities, and it is only in isolated and exceptional cases that we can advance and actively support demands conducive to the establishment of a new class state or to the substitution of a looser federal unity, etc., for the complete political unity of a state. So comment there, Lenin has sort of laid out, the principles of the Social Democratic Party as he sees it. So let's just read that again. As the party of the proletariat, the Social Democratic Party considers it to be its positive and principal task to further the self-determination of the proletariat in each nationality, rather than that of peoples or nations. So you could say, for example, in some of the Marxist criticisms of anarchism, the anarchists believe in liberation through liberation of the individual. And Marxists oppose this, saying you can't just go for liberation of the individual, it has to be class liberation. So in kind of a similar way, the goal here is the self-determination of the proletariat within each nationality. So hopefully you see the distinction. Lenin expands by continuing, we must always and unreservedly work for the very closest, and that's emphasized, unity of the proletariat of all nationalities. And it is only in isolated and exceptional cases, not that it never happens, but in isolated and exceptional cases that we can advance and actively support demands conducive to the establishment of a new class state, or to the substitution of a looser federal unity, etc., for the complete political unity of the state. So this expansive point, Lenin is saying the main thing is usually the complete political unity of the state, and it's only in isolated and exceptional cases that, in his view, Social Democrats could advance and support demands conducive to the establishment of a new class state or looser federal unity. So in general, that second point, looser federal unity, this is more of an anarchist demand. You can read about it in Marx and Engels' 1873, The Bakuninists at Work, which was an account of a revolution gone horribly wrong in Spain with, federalism, every town is its own country kind of thing, having been a central demand there. So Marxists, again, not big on the loose federal unity thing. That's more of a petty bourgeois and anarchist type of demand. Again, the goal being complete political unity of the state, because it was understood that capitalism actually was a centralizing tendency over feudalism. This was viewed as a progressive tendency. So in theorizing the transition from, progressive capitalism into socialism, hopefully before capitalism falls too far into its reactionary, moribund, imperialist condition. So the idea is to pick that up and continue to run with it, because it is that centralizing factor that lends itself to a national planned economy, for example, which would be the basis of socialism as far as beating back market anarchy and all that kind of stuff. That is not what Marxists were interested in. So basically, in this opening, Lenin is saying that they have nothing but support and recognition for struggle for freedom of self-determination, but this doesn't amount to supporting the creation of a new class state in every case. So what does this mean, a new class state? Well, feudalism, capitalism are modes of production which create societies that are class societies. There's a hierarchy where there's a minority ruling class, a smaller part of the population that rules the society, and then a majority working and oppressed class or classes. Socialism is still a transition away from capitalism and class society, but it's an attempt to end it. Socialism is when the working class becomes the ruling class. It's the first time that the ruling class is a majority class. It's the majority of the population. There are still other classes within socialism as it's a transitional state, but the idea is using the rule of the proletariat to stamp out all those class distinctions, re-engineer society in such a way that there are no more class contradictions. So keeping that long-term goal in mind, Marxists are then reluctant to establish, new class states here and there because the overall trend is one of centralization and the abolition of class. However, in some cases, they would support it if that is the best way to recognize and support a particular demand for national self-determination. All right, hopefully that's clear. Let's continue. This explanation of our program on the national question has evoked a strong protest from the Polish Socialist Party, PSP. Footnote, this was a petty bourgeois nationalist party founded in 1892. Continuing. In an article entitled The Attitude of the Russian Social Democrats Towards the National Question, March 1903, the PSP expresses indignation at this, quote, amazing explanation, and at the, quote, vagueness of this, quote, mysterious self-determination of ours. It accuses us both of doctrinairism and of holding the, quote, anarchist view that, quote, the worker is concerned with nothing but the complete abolition of capitalism, since we learn language, nationality, culture, and the like are mere bourgeois inventions, unquote, and so on. It is worth considering this argument in detail, for it reveals almost all the misconceptions in the national question, so common and so widespread among socialists. What makes our explanation so, quote, amazing? Why is it considered a departure from the, quote, literal meaning? Does recognition of the right of nations to self-determination really imply support of any demand of every nation for self-determination? After all, the fact that we recognize the right of all citizens to form free associations does not at all commit us, social democrats, to supporting the formation of any new association, nor does it prevent us from opposing and campaigning against the formation of any given association as an inexpedient and unwise step. We even recognize the right of the Jesuits to carry on agitation freely, but we fight, not by police methods of course, against an alliance between the Jesuits and the proletarians. Consequently, when the PSP says, quote, if this demand for the right to free self-determination is to be taken literally, and that is how we have taken it hitherto, then it would satisfy us, unquote. It is quite obvious that it is precisely the PSP that is departing from the literal meaning of the program. Its conclusion is certainly illogical from the formal point of view. We do not, however, wish to confine ourselves to a formal verification of our explanation. We shall go straight to the root of the matter. Is social democracy in duty bound to demand national independence always and unreservedly, or only under certain circumstances? If the latter is the case, then under which circumstances? To this question, the PSP has always replied in favor of unreserved recognition. We are not in the least surprised, therefore, at the fondness it displays toward the Russian socialist revolutionaries, who demand a federal state system and speak in favor of, quote, complete and unreserved recognition of the right to national self-determination. Quoted from Revolutionary Russia, issue 18, the article entitled National Enslavement and Revolutionary Socialism. Unfortunately, this is nothing more than one of those bourgeois democratic phrases which, for the 100th and 1000th time, reveal the true nature of the so-called party of so-called socialist revolutionaries. By falling for the bait presented by these phrases and yielding to the allurement of this clamor, the PSP in its turn proves how weak in theoretical background and political activities is its link with the class struggle of the proletariat. But it is to the interests of this struggle that we must subordinate the demand for national self-determination. It is this that makes all the difference between our approach to the national question and the bourgeois democratic approach. The bourgeois democrat and the present-day socialist opportunist who follows in their footsteps imagines that democracy eliminates the class struggle, and that is why they present all their political demands in an abstract way, lumped together, quote, without reservations, from the standpoint of the interests of the, quote, whole people, or even from that of an eternal and absolute moral principle. Always and everywhere, the social democrat ruthlessly exposes this bourgeois illusion, whether it finds expression in an abstract idealist philosophy or in an absolute demand for national independence. If there is still need to prove that a Marxist can recognize the demand for national independence only conditionally, namely, on the condition indicated above, let us quote a writer who defended, from the Marxist viewpoint, the Polish proletarians' demand for an independent Poland. In 1896, Karl Kautsky wrote in an article entitled The End of Poland, quote, once the proletariat tackles the Polish question, it it cannot but take a stand in favor of Poland's independence, and consequently, it cannot but welcome each step that can be taken in this direction at the present time, insofar as this step is at all compatible with the class interests of the international militant proletariat." Unquote. Quote, "This reservation," Kautsky goes on to say, quote, "should be made in any case. National independence is not so inseparably linked with the class interests of the militant proletariat as to make it necessary to strive for it unconditionally, under any circumstances. Marx and Engels took a most determined stand in favor of the unification and liberation of Italy, but this did not prevent them from coming out in 1859 against an Italy allied with Napoleon." Quoting from Neue Zeit. As you see, Kautsky categorically rejects the unconditional demand for the independence of nations. Comment here on Kautsky, by the way. Later, Lenin would turn on Kautsky for Kautsky's opportunist defense of World War I, telling workers to go fight for the bourgeoisie. However, Lenin says even in those later, like 1914, 15, 16 screeds against Kautsky, that he used to be a good Marxist, and this is more from the days of his having been a good Marxist. Continuing. As you see, Kautsky categorically rejects the unconditional demand for the independence of nations, and categorically demands that the question be placed not merely on a historical basis in general, but specifically on a class basis. And if we examine how Marx and Engels treated the Polish question, we shall see that this was precisely their approach to it from the very outset. Die Neue Rheinische Zeitung, Marx and Engels' newspaper, more on that in a minute in a footnote, devoted much space to the Polish question, and emphatically demanded not only the independence of Poland, but also that Germany go to war with Russia for Poland's freedom. At the same time, Marx, however, attacked Rüge, who had spoken in favor of Poland's freedom in the Frankfurt Parliament, and had tried to settle the Polish question solely by means of bourgeois democratic phrases about, quote, "shameful injustice," without making any attempt to analyze it historically. Marx was not like those pedants and philistines of the Revolution who dread nothing more than polemics at revolutionary moments in history. Marx poured pitiless scorn on the, quote, "humane citizen Rüge," and showed him, from the example of the oppression of the south of France by the north of France, that it is not every kind of national oppression that invariably inspires a desire for independence, which is justified from the viewpoint of democracy and the proletariat. Marx referred to special social circumstances as a result of which, quote, "Poland became the revolutionary part of Russia, Austria, and Prussia. Even the Polish nobility, although their foundations were still partly feudal, adhered to the democratic agrarian revolution with unparalleled selflessness. Poland was already a seat of East European democracy at a time when Germany was still groping her way through the most platitudinous constitutional and high-flown philosophical ideology. So long as we Germans help to oppress Poland, so long as we keep part of Poland fettered to Germany, we shall remain fettered to Russia and Russian policy. We shall be unable completely to smash patriarchal feudal absolutism at home. The creation of a democratic Poland is the primary prerequisite of the creation of a democratic Germany." Unquote. A couple of footnotes there. Lenin is quoting from the series of articles printed under the general title of "Debates on the Polish Question in Frankfurt" in the Neue Rheinische Zeitung in August to September 1848. Engels was the author of these articles. There's another footnote more generally. Die Neue Rheinische Zeitung, or the New Rhenish Gazette, appeared in Cologne from June 1st, 1848 until May 19, 1849. Marx and Engels were managers of this newspaper, Marx being editor-in-chief. As Lenin put it, the newspaper was, quote, "the best, unsurpassed organ of the revolutionary proletariat." It educated the masses, roused them to fight the counter-revolution, and made its influence felt throughout Germany. Because of its resolute and irreconcilable position and its militant internationalism, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung was, from the first months of its existence, persecuted by the feudal monarchist and liberal bourgeois press, and also by the government. Marx's deportation by the Prussian government and the repressive measures against its other editors led to the paper's ceasing circulation. About the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, see the article by Engels, Marx and the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, 1848 to 1849. Back to the main text. We have quoted these statements in such detail because they graphically show the historical background at a time when the attitude of international social democracy to the Polish problem took shape in a way which held good almost throughout the second half of the 19th century. To ignore the changes which have taken place in that background and to continue advocating the old solutions given by Marxism would mean being true to the letter but not to the spirit of the teaching, would mean repeating the old conclusions by rote without being able to use the Marxist method of research to analyze the new political situation. Those times and today, the age of the last bourgeois revolutionary movements and the age of desperate reaction, extreme tension of all forces on the eve of the proletarian revolution, differ in the most obvious way. In those times, Poland as a whole, not only the peasantry but even the bulk of the nobility, was revolutionary. The traditions of the struggle for national liberation were so strong and deep-rooted that after their defeat at home, Poland's best sons went wherever they could find a revolutionary class to support. The memory of Dąbrowski and of Wróblewski is inseparably associated with the greatest movement of the proletariat in the 19th century, with the last, and let us hope the last unsuccessful, insurrection of the Paris workers. Quick footnote there, Yaroslav Dąbrowski and Walery Wróblewski were prominent leaders of the Polish revolutionary movement in 1863 to 64. They emigrated to France after the suppression of the Polish uprising. In 1871, they were generals in the Paris Commune. Continuing, in those times, complete victory for democracy in Europe was indeed impossible without the restoration of Poland. In those times, Poland was indeed the bulwark of civilization against Tsarism and the vanguard of democracy. Today, the Polish ruling classes, the gentry in Germany and in Austria, and the industrial and financial magnates in Russia are supporting the ruling classes of the countries that oppress Poland, while the German and the Russian proletariat are fighting for freedom side by side with the Polish proletariat, which has heroically taken over the great traditions of the old revolutionary Poland. Today, the advanced representatives of Marxism in the neighboring country, while attentively watching the political evolution of Europe and fully sympathizing with the heroic struggles of the Poles, nevertheless frankly admit that, quote, at present, St. Petersburg has become a much more important revolutionary center than Warsaw, and the Russian revolutionary movement is already of greater international significance than the Polish movement, unquote. This is what Kautsky wrote as early as 1896 in defending the inclusion in the Polish Social Democrats' program of the demand for Poland's restoration. And in 1902, Mering, who has been studying the evolution of the Polish question since 1848, arrived at the following conclusion, quote, had the Polish proletariat desired to inscribe on its banner the restoration of a Polish class state, which the ruling classes themselves do not want to hear of, it would be playing a historical farce. This may well happen to the propertied classes, as for instance the Polish nobility in 1791, but it should never happen to the working class. If, on the other hand, this reactionary utopia comes out to win over to proletarian agitation, those sections of the intelligentsia and of the petty bourgeoisie which still respond in some measure to national agitation, then that utopia is doubly untenable as an outgrowth of that unworthy opportunism which sacrifices the long-term interests of the working class to the cheap and paltry successes of the moment. Quote, those interests dictate categorically that in all three states that had partitioned Poland, the Polish workers should fight unreservedly, side by side with their class comrades. The times are past when a bourgeois revolution could create a free Poland. Today, the renaissance of Poland is possible only through a social revolution, in the course of which the modern proletariat will break its chains, unquote. Footnote, Lenin is quoting here Franz Mering's introduction to the third volume of the collected works of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, 1841 to 1850, which he published in 1902. Continuing, we fully subscribe to Mering's conclusion. We shall only remark that this conclusion remains unassailable even if we do not go as far as Mering in our arguments. Without any doubt, the present state of the Polish question differs radically from that which obtained 50 years ago. However, the present situation cannot be regarded as permanent. Class antagonism has now undoubtedly relegated national questions far into the background. But without the risk of lapsing into doctrinarism, it cannot be categorically asserted that some particular national question cannot appear temporarily in the foreground of the political drama. No doubt, the restoration of Poland prior to the fall of capitalism is highly improbable, but it cannot be asserted that it is absolutely impossible, or that circumstances may not arise under which the Polish bourgeoisie will take the side of independence, etc. And Russian social democracy does not in the least intend to tie its own hands. In including in its program recognition of the right of nations to self-determination, it takes into account all possible and even all conceivable combinations. That program in no way precludes the adoption by the Polish proletariat of the slogan of a free and independent Polish republic, even though the probability of its becoming a reality before socialism is introduced is infinitesimal. The program merely demands that a genuinely socialist party shall not corrupt proletarian class consciousness, or slur over the class struggle, or lure working class with bourgeois democratic phrases, or break the unity of the proletariat's present-day political struggle. This reservation is the crux of the matter, for only with this reservation do we recognize self-determination. So comment, this is a pretty important point. Back in the beginning, we talked about how the Social Democrats, Marxists, did not just willy-nilly support the creation of new class states, new bourgeois republics, new bourgeois nation states, although there may be some circumstances where that's possible. So what Lenin is saying here is their program, the recognition of the right of nations to self-determination, it, quote, in no way precludes the adoption by the Polish proletariat, the Polish working class, of the slogan of a free and independent Polish republic. Lenin adds, though, that the probability of a Polish republic becoming a reality without socialism or still under capitalism is incredibly small. So the Polish proletariat could adopt such a slogan. It's not likely to happen, but whatever. The main thing, Lenin says, in other words, the crux of the matter in his words, is that a genuinely socialist party shall not corrupt proletarian class consciousness, or slur over the class struggle, or lure the working class away from class struggle with bourgeois democratic phrases, or break the unity of the proletariat's present-day political struggle. So, as Lenin says, it is with only this reservation that they recognize self-determination. So basically, the main thing is demand what you will, but you're not going to slur over the class struggle, corrupt proletarian class consciousness. You're not going to lead workers away from the central thing, the struggle for socialism, the class struggle. That needs to remain front and center. And any demands for national self-determination or independence cannot come in the way of that. Continuing. It is useless for the PSP to pretend that it differs from the German or Russian Social Democrats in their rejection of the right to self-determination, the right to strive for a free and independent republic. It is not this, but the fact that it loses sight of the class point of view, obscures the class point of view by chauvinism, and disrupts the unity of the present-day political struggle that prevents us from regarding the PSP as a genuine social democratic workers' party. This, for instance, is how the PSP usually presents the question, quote, we can only weaken Tsarism by wresting Poland from it. It is the task of the Russian comrades to overthrow it. Or again, quote, after the overthrow of Tsarism, we would simply decide our fate by seceding from Russia, unquote. See to what monstrous conclusions this monstrous logic leads, even from the viewpoint of the program demand for Poland's restoration. Because the restoration of Poland is one of the possible, but while the bourgeoisie rules by no means absolutely certain, consequences of democratic evolution, therefore, the Polish proletariat must not fight together with the Russian proletariat to overthrow Tsarism, but, quote, only to weaken it by wresting Poland from it. Because Russian Tsarism is concluding a closer and closer alliance with the bourgeoisie and the governments of Germany, Austria, etc., therefore, the Polish proletariat must weaken its alliance with the proletariat of Russia, Germany, etc., together with whom it is now fighting against one and the same yoke. This is nothing more than sacrificing the most vital interests of the proletariat to the bourgeois democratic conception of national independence. The disintegration of Russia, of which the PSP desires, as distinct from our aim of overthrowing Tsarism, is and will remain an empty phrase, as long as economic development continues to bring the different parts of a political whole more and more closely together, And as long as the bourgeoisie of all countries unite more and more closely against their common enemy, the proletariat, and in support of their common ally, the Tsar. But the division of the forces of the proletariat, which is now suffering under the yoke of this autocracy, is the sad reality, the direct consequence, in fact, of the error of the PSP, the direct outcome of its worship of bourgeois democratic formulas. To turn a blind eye to this division of the proletariat, the PSP has to stoop to chauvinism and present the views of the Russian Social Democrats as follows, quote, "We, the Poles, must wait for the social revolution, and until then we must patiently endure national oppression," unquote. This is an utter falsehood. The Russian Social Democrats have never advised anything of the sort. On the contrary, they themselves fight and call upon the whole Russian proletariat to fight against all manifestations of national oppression in Russia. They include in their program not only complete equality of status for all languages, nationalities, etc., but also recognition of every nation's right to determine its own destiny. Recognizing this right, we subordinate to the interests of the proletarian struggle our support of the demand for national independence, and only a chauvinist can interpret our position as an expression of a Russian's mistrust of a non-Russian. In reality, this position necessarily follows from the class-conscious proletarian's distrust of the bourgeoisie. The PSP takes the view that the national question is exhausted by the contrast we Poles versus they, Germans, Russians, etc. The Social Democrat, however, gives first place to the contrast we, the proletarians, and they, the bourgeoisie. We, the proletarians, have seen dozens of times how the bourgeoisie betrays the interests of freedom, motherland, language, and nation when it is confronted with the revolutionary proletariat. We witnessed the French bourgeoisie surrender to the Prussians at the moment of the greatest humiliation and suppression of the French nation, the government of national defense becoming a government of national defection. The bourgeoisie of an oppressed nation calling to its aid the troops of the oppressing nation so as to crush its proletarian fellow countrymen who had dared to assume power. And that is why, undeterred by chauvinist and opportunist heckling, we shall always say to the Polish workers, only the most complete and intimate alliance with the Russian proletariat can meet the requirements of the present political struggle against the autocracy. Only such an alliance can guarantee complete political and economic emancipation. What we have said on the Polish question is wholly applicable to every other national question. The accursed history of autocracy has left us a legacy of tremendous estrangement between the working classes of the various nationalities oppressed by that autocracy. This estrangement is a very great evil, a very great obstacle in the struggle against the autocracy, and we must not legitimize this evil or sanctify this outrageous state of affairs by establishing any such principles as separate parties or a federation of parties. It is, of course, simpler and easier to follow the line of least resistance, and for everyone to make themselves comfortable in their own corner following the rule is none of my business, as the Bund now wants to do. The more we realize the need for unity, and the more firmly we're convinced that a concerted offensive against the autocracy is impossible without complete unity, the more obvious becomes the necessity for a centralized organization of the struggle in the conditions of our political system, the less inclined are we to be satisfied with a simple but specious and at bottom profoundly false solution of the problem. So long as the injuriousness of estrangement is not realized, and so long as there is no desire to put an end radically and at all costs to this estrangement in the camp of the Proletarian Party, there is no need for the fig leaf of federation, and no use in undertaking to solve a problem which one of the sides concerned has no real desire to solve. That being the case, it is better to let the lessons of experience and of the actual movement prove that centralism is essential for success in the struggle waged by the proletarians of all nationalities oppressed by autocracy against that autocracy and against the international bourgeoisie, which is becoming more and more united. And that's the end of the audiobook. So, what do you think? Leave a question or comment below. I like this one. I've given most of my comments already. I think that these are important principles to understand. I think that this one was pretty clear, but again, questions or comments go below. We'll continue it there. And this one will be going in the Marxism and the National Question and War playlist. Make sure to check that out. But in the meantime, thanks for listening. And thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. Again, we don't run ads on this channel, so the support we get through the Patreon is the only financial support. Every donation is encouraging. They're also materially helpful, so thank you to everyone for that. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month or more, whatever you see fit. Beyond that, engagement also helps, so liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting on the videos and channel, all of that helps to boost it in the YouTube algorithm, puts it in front of more eyes and ears, expands the audience, and just makes the content easier for various working people out there who currently aren't part of the audience to stumble across it and become educated and become part of that audience. We're trying to make this as accessible as possible. Your engagement with the channel helps that, and future viewers thank you for it. Finally, don't forget to get out in the real world and get organized. All the agitation and education in the world online will only get you so far. It is important to have this theoretical, historical knowledge to be informed and armed by it in the struggle, but the struggle takes place in our communities across the country. Get involved, meet other comrades, network. We got to build this thing, and nobody's going to do it for us. Thanks again, and we will catch you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the March 2021 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook of Vladimir Lenin's To the Rural Poor from 1903. If you like this video, please click the like button and the subscribe button, and consider supporting me on Patreon. There is a link to the Patreon in the description. So, this is, again, To the Rural Poor, an explanation for the peasants of what the Social Democrats want, written in March 1903 by Vladimir Lenin. It was published as a pamphlet in May 1903 in Geneva by the League of Russian Social Democracy Abroad. It was published according to the text of the pamphlet. Source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1964, Moscow, Volume 6. Transcription and markup by R. Simbala and D. Walters. And it's in the public domain, Lenin Internet Archive 2003. Quick comment from Socialism for All before we get into the text itself. This is a conversation I feel like we definitely need to have in the United States, basically communicating to the rural poor, exactly as the title says, an explanation of what we as socialists want and stand for. I see some people kind of trying to do this badly, basically taking a bunch of right-wing attitudes and basically just collective social ignorance, and then labeling it Marxist and saying, yay, we're doing Marxism right-wing style. That's not really what we need to do. We need to bring the rural poor into the fold of class consciousness, not lower our standards to whatever the hell is going on in the right-wing populist world. That's no good. I mean, right-wing populism, it's hucksterism, it's trickery that the capitalists pull on the rural poor to insult their intelligence, get their support, and then just bilk them for, just advancing capitalism. That's all it really is about. We need to be better than merely just, putting a hammer and sickle on top of that and calling it good. So let's get into the text and see what Lenin had to say in 1903. Section 1, the struggle of the urban workers. Many peasants have probably heard about the labor unrest in the towns. Some of them have themselves been in the capitals and in the factories, and have seen the riots, as the police call them. Others know workers who were involved in the unrest and were deported to their villages by the authorities. Others again must have seen the leaflets issued by the workers, or pamphlets about the workers' struggle. Still others have only heard stories about what is going on in the towns from people with first-hand experience. Formerly, only students rebelled, but now thousands and tens of thousands of workers have risen in all the big towns. In most cases, they fight against their employers, against the factory owners, against the capitalists. The workers declare strikes. All of them stop work at a factory at the same time and demand higher wages, demand that they should be made to work not 11 or 10 hours a day, but only 8 hours. The workers also demand other things that would make the working man's life easier. They want the workshops to be in better condition and the machines to be protected by special devices so as to prevent them from maiming the workers. They want their children to be able to go to school, and the sick to be given proper aid in the hospitals. They want the workers' homes to be like human dwellings instead of being like pigsties. The police intervene in the workers' struggle. The police seize workers, throw them into prison, deport them without trial to their villages, or even to Siberia. The government has passed laws banning strikes and workers' meetings. But the workers wage their fight against the police and against the government. The workers say, we, millions of working people, have bent our backs long enough. We have worked for the rich and remained paupers long enough. We have allowed them to rob us long enough. We want to unite in unions, to unite all the workers in one big workers' union, a workers' party, and to strive jointly for a better life. We want to achieve a new and better order of society. In this new and better society, there must be neither rich nor poor. All will have to work. Not a handful of rich people, but all the working people must enjoy the fruits of their common labor. Machines and other improvements must serve to ease the work of all, and not to enable a few to grow rich at the expense of millions and tens of millions of people. This new and better society is called socialist society. The teachings about this society are called socialism. The workers' unions which fight for this better order of society are called social democratic parties. Such parties exist openly in nearly all countries except Russia and Turkey. And our workers, together with socialists from among the educated people, have also formed a party, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. The government persecutes that party, but it exists in secret despite all prohibitions. It publishes its newspapers and pamphlets and organizes secret unions. The workers not only meet in secret, but come out into the streets in crowds and unfurl their banners bearing the inscriptions, "Long live the 8-hour day, long live freedom, long live socialism." The government savagely persecutes the workers for this. It even sends troops to shoot down the workers. Russian soldiers have killed Russian workers in Yaroslavl, St. Petersburg, Riga, Rostov-on-Don, and Zlatoust. But the workers do not yield. They continue the fight. They say, neither persecution, prison, deportation, penal servitude, nor death can frighten us. Our cause is a just one. We're fighting for the freedom and the happiness of all who work. We're fighting to free tens and hundreds of millions of people from abuse of power, oppression, and poverty. The workers are becoming more and more class conscious. The number of social democrats is growing fast in all countries. We shall win despite all persecution. The rural poor must understand who these social democrats are, what they want, and what must be done in the countryside to help the social democrats to win happiness for the people. Section 2. What do the social democrats want? The Russian social democrats are first and foremost striving to win political liberty. They need political liberty in order to unite all the Russian workers extensively and openly in the struggle for a new and better socialist order of society. What is political liberty? To understand this, the peasant should first compare his present state of freedom with serfdom. Under the serf-owning system, the peasant couldn't marry without the landlord's permission. Today, the peasant is free to marry without anyone's permission. Under the serf-owning system, the peasant had unfailingly to work for his landlord on days fixed by the latter's bailiff. Today, the peasant is free to decide which employer to work for, on which days, and for what pay. Under the serf-owning system, the peasant could not leave his village without the landlord's permission. Today, the peasant is free to go wherever he pleases, if the mir allows him to, if he is not in arrears with his taxes, if he can get a passport, and if the governor or police chief does not forbid his changing residence. Thus, even today, the peasant is not quite free to go where he pleases. He does not enjoy complete freedom of movement. The peasant is still a semi-serf. Later on, we shall explain in detail why the Russian peasant is still a semi-serf and what he must do to escape from this condition. Under the serf-owning system, the peasant had no right to acquire property without the landlord's permission. He couldn't buy land. Today, the peasant is free to acquire any kind of property, but even today, he is not quite free to leave the mir. He is not quite free to dispose of his land as he pleases. Under the serf owning system, the peasant could be flogged by order of the landlord. Today, the peasant cannot be flogged by order of the landlord, although he is still liable to corporal punishment. This freedom is called civil liberty, freedom in family matters, in private matters, in matters concerning property. The peasant and the worker are free, although not quite, to arrange their family life and their private affairs, to dispose of their labor, choose their employer, and their property. But neither the Russian workers nor the Russian people as a whole are yet free to arrange their public affairs. The people as a whole are the serfs of the government officials, just as the peasants were the serfs of the landlords. The Russian people have no right to choose their officials, no right to elect representatives to legislate for the whole country. The Russian people have not even the right to arrange meetings for the discussion of state affairs. We dare not even print newspapers or books, and dare not even speak to all and for all on matters concerning the whole state without permission from officials who have been put in authority over us, without our consent, just as the landlord used to appoint his bailiff without the consent of the peasants. Just as the peasants were the slaves of the landlords, so the Russian people are still the slaves of the officials. Just as the peasants lacked civil freedom under the serf-owning system, so the Russian people still lack political liberty. Political liberty means the freedom of the people to arrange their public state affairs. Political liberty means the right of the people to elect their representatives, deputies, to a state Duma, parliament. All laws should be discussed and passed. All taxes should be fixed only by such a state Duma, parliament, elected by the people themselves. Political liberty means the right of the people themselves to choose all their officials, arrange all kinds of meetings for the discussion of all state affairs, and publish whatever papers and books they please without having to ask for permission. All the other European peoples won political liberty for themselves long ago. Only in Turkey and in Russia are the people still politically enslaved by the Sultan's government and by the Tsarist autocratic government. Tsarist autocracy means the unlimited power of the Tsar. The people have no voice in determining the structure of the state or in running it. All laws are made and all officials are appointed by the Tsar alone, by his personal, unlimited autocratic authority. But of course, the Tsar cannot even know all Russian laws and all Russian officials. The Tsar cannot even know all that goes on in the country. The Tsar simply endorses the will of a few score of the richest and most high-born officials. However much he may desire to, one man cannot govern a vast country like Russia. It is not the Tsar who governs Russia. It is only a manner of speech to talk about autocratic one-man rule. Russia is governed by a handful of the richest and most high-born officials. The Tsar learns only what this handful are pleased to tell him. The Tsar cannot go in any way against the will of this handful of high-ranking nobles. The Tsar himself is a landlord and a member of the nobility. Since his earliest childhood, he has lived only among these high-born people. It was they who brought him up and educated him. He knows about the Russian people as a whole only that which is known to these noble gentry, these rich landlords, and the very few rich merchants who are received at the Tsar's court. In every Volost administration office, you will find the same picture hanging on the wall. It depicts the Tsar, Alexander III, father of the present Tsar, speaking to the Volost headmen who have come to his coronation. Obey your marshals of the nobility, the Tsar is ordering them. And the present Tsar, Nicholas II, has repeated those words. Thus, the Tsars themselves admit that they can govern the country only with the aid of the nobility and through the nobility. We must well remember that all the other European peoples won political liberty for themselves long ago. Only in Turkey and in Russia are the people still politically enslaved by the Sultan's government and by the Tsarist autocratic government. Tsarist autocracy means the unlimited power of the Tsar. The people have no voice in determining the structure of the state or in running it. All laws are made and all officials are appointed by the Tsar alone, by his personal, unlimited autocratic authority. But of course, the Tsar cannot even know all Russian laws and all Russian officials. The Tsar cannot even know all that goes on in the country. The Tsar simply endorses the will of a few score of the richest and most high-born officials. However much he may desire to, One man cannot govern a vast country like Russia. It is not the Tsar who governs Russia. It is only a manner of speech to talk about autocratic one-man rule. Russia is governed by a handful of the richest and most high-born officials. The Tsar learns only what this handful are pleased to tell him. The Tsar cannot go in any way against the will of this handful of high-ranking nobles. The Tsar himself is a landlord and a member of the nobility. Since his earliest childhood, he has lived only among these high-born people. It was they who brought him up and educated him. He knows about the Russian people as a whole only that which is known to these noble gentry, these rich landlords, and the very few rich merchants who are received at the Tsar's court. In every Volost administration office, you will find the same picture hanging on the wall. It depicts the Tsar, Alexander III, father of the present Tsar, speaking to the Volost headmen who have come to his coronation. Obey your marshals of the nobility, the Tsar is ordering them. And the present Tsar, Nicholas II, has repeated those words. Thus, the Tsars themselves admit that they can govern the country only with the aid of the nobility and through the nobility. We must well remember those words of the Tsars about the peasants having to obey the nobility. We must clearly understand what a lie is being told the people by those who try to make out that Tsarist government is the best form of government. In other countries, those people say the government is elected, but it is the rich who are elected, and they govern unjustly and oppress the poor. In Russia, the government is not elected. An autocratic Tsar governs the whole country. The Tsar stands above everyone, rich and poor. The Tsar, they tell us, is just to everyone, to the poor and to the rich alike. Such talk is sheer hypocrisy. Every Russian knows the kind of justice that is dispensed by our government. Everybody knows whether a plain worker or a farm laborer in our country can become a member of the state council. In all other European countries, however, factory workers and farmhands have been elected to the State Duma, parliament. They've been able to speak freely to all the people about the miserable condition of the workers and call upon the workers to unite and fight for a better life. And no one has dared to stop these speeches of the people's representatives. No policeman has dared to lay a finger on them. In Russia, there is no elective government, and she is governed not merely by the rich and the high-born, but by the worst of these. She is governed by the most skillful intriguers at the Tsar's court, by the most artful tricksters, by those who carry lies and slander to the Tsar and flatter and toady to him. They govern in secret. The people do not and cannot know what new laws are being drafted, what wars are being hatched, what new taxes are being introduced, which officials are being rewarded and for what services, and which are being dismissed. In no country is there such a multitude of officials as in Russia. These officials tower above the voiceless people like a dark forest. A mere worker can never make his way through this forest, can never obtain justice. Not a single complaint against bribery, robbery, or abuse of power on the part of the officials is ever brought to light. Every complaint is smothered in official red tape. The voice of the individual never reaches the whole people, but is lost in this dark jungle, stifled in the police torture chamber. An army of officials who are never elected by the people, who are not responsible to the people, has woven a thick web, and men and women are struggling in this web like flies. Tsarist autocracy is an autocracy of officials. Tsarist autocracy means the feudal dependence of the people upon the officials and especially upon the police. Tsarist autocracy is police autocracy. That is why the workers come out into the streets with banners bearing the inscriptions, "Down with the autocracy, long live political liberty." That is why the tens of millions of the rural poor must also support and take up this battle cry of the urban workers. Like them, undaunted by persecution, fearless of the enemy's threats and violence, and undeterred by the first reverses, the agricultural laborers and the poor peasants must come forward for a decisive struggle for the freedom of the whole of the Russian people and demand, first of all, the convocation of the representatives of the people. Let the people themselves, all over Russia, elect their representatives, deputies. Let those representatives form a Supreme Assembly, which will introduce elective government in Russia, free the people from feudal dependence upon the officials and the police, and secure for the people the right to meet freely, speak freely, and have a free press. That is what the Social Democrats want first and foremost. That is the meaning of their first demand, the demand for political liberty. We know that political liberty, free elections to the State Duma, Parliament, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, will not at once deliver the working people from poverty and oppression. There is no means of immediately delivering the poor of town and country from the burden of working for the rich. The working people have no one to place their hopes in and no one to rely upon but themselves. Nobody will free the working man from poverty if he does not free himself. And to free themselves, the workers of the whole country, the whole of Russia, must unite in one union, in one party. But millions of workers cannot unite if the autocratic police government bans all meetings, all workers' newspapers, and the election of workers' deputies. To unite, they must have the right to form unions of every kind, must have freedom to unite, they must enjoy political liberty. Political liberty will not at once deliver the working people from poverty, but it will give the workers a weapon with which to fight poverty. There is no other means, and there can be no other means of fighting poverty, except the unity of the workers themselves. But millions of people cannot unite unless there is political liberty. In all European countries, where the people have won political liberty, the workers began to unite long ago. Throughout the whole of Europe, workers who own no land and no workshops and work for other people for wages all their lives are called proletarians. Over 50 years ago, the call was sounded for the working people to unite. Workers of all countries, unite. During the past 50 years, these words have circled the whole globe, are repeated at tens and hundreds of thousands of workers' meetings, and can be read in millions of social democratic pamphlets and newspapers in every language. Of course, to unite millions of workers in one union, in one party, is an extremely difficult task. It requires time, persistence, perseverance, and courage. The workers are ground down by poverty and want, benumbed by ceaseless toil for the capitalists and landlords. Often they have not even the time to think of why they remain perpetual paupers or how to be delivered from this. Everything is done to prevent the workers from uniting, either by means of direct and brutal violence, as in countries like Russia where there's no political liberty, or by refusing to employ workers who preach the doctrines of socialism, or lastly, by means of deceit and bribery. But no violence or persecution can stop the proletarian workers from fighting for the great cause of the emancipation of all working people from poverty and oppression. The number of social democratic workers is constantly growing. Take our neighboring country, Germany. There, they have elective government. Formerly, in Germany too, there was an unlimited, autocratic, monarchist government. But long ago, over 50 years ago, the German people destroyed the autocracy and won political liberty by force. In Germany, laws are not made by a handful of officials, as in Russia, but by an assembly of people's representatives, by a parliament, by the Reichstag, as the Germans call it. All adult males take part in electing deputies to this assembly. This makes it possible to count how many votes were cast for the Social Democrats. In 1887, 1/10 of all votes were cast for the Social Democrats. In 1898, when the most recent elections to the Reichstag took place, the Social Democratic vote increased nearly threefold. This time, more than 1/4 of all the votes were cast for the Social Democrats. Over 2 million adult males voted for Social Democratic candidates to Parliament. Among the farm laborers of Germany, socialism is not yet widespread, but it is now making very rapid progress among them. And when the masses of farmhands, day laborers, and poor pauperized peasants unite with their brothers in the towns, the German workers will win and establish an order under which the working people will suffer neither poverty nor oppression. By what means do the Social Democratic workers want to deliver the people from poverty? To know this, one must clearly understand the cause of the poverty of the vast masses of the people under the present social order. Rich cities are growing, magnificent shops and houses are being built, railways are being constructed. All kinds of machines and improvements are being introduced in industry and agriculture, but millions of people remain in poverty and continue to work all their lives to provide a bare subsistence for their families. That is not all. More and more people are becoming unemployed. Both in town and country, there are more and more people who can find no work at all. In the villages, they starve, while in the towns, they swell the ranks of the tramps and the down and outs, find refuge like beasts in dugouts on the outskirts of towns or in dreadful slums and cellars, such as those in the Kitrov market in Moscow. Why is this? Wealth and luxury are increasing, and and yet the millions and millions who by their labor create all this wealth remain in poverty and want. Peasants are dying of starvation, workers wander about without employment, and yet merchants export millions of pounds of grain from Russia to foreign countries. Factories are standing idle because the goods cannot be sold, for there's no market for them. The cause of all this is, first of all, that most of the land and also the factories, workshops, machines, buildings, ships, etc., belong to a small number of rich people. Tens of millions of people work on this land and at these factories and workshops, but they're all owned by a few thousand or tens of thousands of rich people, landlords, merchants, and factory owners. The people work for these rich men for hire, for wages, for a crust of bread. All that is produced over and above what is required to provide a bare subsistence for the workers goes to the rich. This is their profit, their, quote, income. All the benefits arising from the use of machines and from improvements in methods of production go to the landowners and capitalists. They accumulate wealth untold, while the workers get only a miserable pittance. The workers are brought together for work. On large estates and at big factories, several hundred, and sometimes even several thousand workers are employed. When labor is united in this way, and when the most diverse kinds of machines are employed, work becomes more productive. One worker produces much more than scores of workers did working separately and without the aid of machines. But the benefits of this more productive labor go not to all the working people, but to an insignificant number of big landowners, merchants, and factory owners. One often hears it said that the landlords and merchants provide work for the people, that they provide the poor with earnings. It is said, for instance, that a neighboring factory or neighboring landlord maintains the local peasants. Actually, however, the workers by their labor maintain themselves and also all those who do not work themselves. But for permission to work on the landlord's land, at a factory, or on a railway, the worker gives the owner gratis all he produces, and while the worker himself gets only enough for a bare subsistence. Actually, therefore, it is not the landlords and the merchants who give the workers employment, but the workers who by their labor maintain everybody, surrendering gratis the greater part of their labor. Further, in all present-day states, the people's poverty is due to the fact that the workers produce all sorts of articles for sale for the market. The factory owner and the artisan, the landlord and the well-to-do peasant produce various goods, raise cattle, sow and harvest grain for sale in order to obtain money. Money has everywhere become the ruling power. All the goods produced by human labor are exchanged for money. With money, you can buy anything. With money, you can even buy a man. That is to say, force a man who owns nothing to work for another who has money. Formerly, land used to be the ruling power. That was the case under the serf owning system. Whoever possessed land possessed power and authority. Today, however, money, capital, has become the ruling power. With money, you can buy as much land as you like. Without money, you will not be able to do much even if you have land. You must have money to buy a plow or other implements, to buy livestock, to buy clothes and other town-made goods, not to speak of paying taxes. For the sake of money, nearly all the landlords have mortgaged their estates to the banks. To get money, the government borrows from rich people and bankers all over the world and pays hundreds of millions of rubles yearly in interest on these loans. For the sake of money, everyone today is waging a fierce war against everyone else. Each tries to buy cheap and to sell dear. Each tries to get ahead of the other, to sell as many goods as possible, to undercut the other, to conceal from him a profitable market or a profitable contract. In this general scramble for money, the little man, the petty artisan, or the small peasant fares worse than all. He is always left behind by the rich merchant or the rich peasant. The little man never has any reserves. He lives from hand to mouth. Each difficulty or accident compels him to pawn his last belongings or to sell his livestock at a trifling price. Once he has fallen into the clutches of a kulak or of a usurer, he very rarely succeeds in escaping from the net, and in most cases he is utterly ruined. Every year, tens and hundreds of thousands of small peasants and artisans lock up their cottages, surrender their holdings to the commune gratis, and become wage workers, farmhands, unskilled workers, proletarians. But the rich grow richer and richer in this struggle for money. They pile up millions and hundreds of millions of rubles in the banks and make profit not only with their own money, but also with the money deposited in the banks by others. The little man who deposits a few score or a few hundred rubles in a bank or a savings bank receives interest at the rate of 3 or 4 kopecks to the ruble. But the rich make millions out of these scores and use these millions to increase their turnover and make 10 and 20 kopecks to the ruble. That is why the Social Democratic workers say that the only way to put an end to the poverty of the people is to change the existing order from top to bottom throughout the country and to establish a socialist order. In other words, to take the estates from the big landowners, the factories from the factory owners, and money capital from the bankers, to abolish their private property and turn it over to the whole working people throughout the country. When that is done, the workers' labor will be made use of, not by rich people living on the labor of others, but by the workers themselves and by those elected by them. The fruits of common labor and the advantages from all improvements and machinery will then benefit all the working people, all the workers. Wealth will then grow at a still faster rate because the workers will work better for themselves than they did for the capitalists. The working day will be shorter. The workers' standard of living will be higher. All their conditions of life will be completely changed. But it is not an easy matter to change the existing order throughout the country. That requires a great deal of effort, a long and stubborn struggle. All the rich, all the property owners, all the bourgeoisie will defend their riches with all their might. The officials and the army will rise to defend all the rich class because the government itself is in the hands of the rich class. The workers must rally as one man for the struggle against all those who live on the labor of others. The workers themselves must unite and help to unite all the poor in a single working class, in a single proletarian class. The struggle will not be easy for the working class, but it will certainly end in the workers' victory because the bourgeoisie, or those who live on the labor of others, are an insignificant minority of the population, while the working class is the vast majority. The workers against the property owners means millions against thousands. There's a note there on bourgeoisie. Bourgeois means a property owner. The bourgeoisie are all the property owners taken together. A big bourgeois is the owner of big property. A petty bourgeois is the owner of small property. The words bourgeoisie and proletariat mean the same as property owners and workers, the rich and the poor, or those who live on the labor of others and those who work for others for wages. Back to the text. The workers in Russia are already beginning to unite for this great struggle in a single workers' social democratic party. Difficult as it is to unite in secret, hiding from the police, nevertheless, the organization is growing and gaining strength. When the Russian people have won political liberty, the work of uniting the working class, the cause of socialism, will advance much more rapidly than it is advancing among the German workers. That's the end of section 2. On to section 3, riches and poverty, property owners, and workers in the countryside. We now know what the Social Democrats want. They want to fight the whole of the rich class to free the people from poverty. In our countryside, there is no less, and perhaps even more poverty than there is in the towns. We shall not speak here about how great the poverty is in the countryside is. Every worker who has been in the country and every peasant are well acquainted with want, hunger, and ruin in the countryside. But the peasant does not know the cause of his distress, hunger, and destitution, or how to rid himself of this want. To know this, one must first find out what causes all want and poverty in both town and countryside. We have already dealt with this briefly, and we have seen that the poor peasants and rural workers must unite with the urban workers, but that is not enough. We must also find out what sort of people in the countryside will follow the rich, the property owners, and what sort of people will follow the workers, the Social Democrats. We must find out whether there are many peasants who, no less than the landlords, are able to acquire capital and live on the labor of others. Unless we get to the bottom of this matter, no amount of talking about poverty will be of any use, and the rural poor will not know who in the countryside must unite among themselves and with the urban workers, or what must be done to make it a dependable union and to prevent the peasant from being hoodwinked by his own kind, the rich peasant, as well as by the landlord. To get to the bottom of this, let us now see how strong the landlords are and how strong the rich peasants are in the countryside. Let us begin with the landlords. We can judge their strength in the first place by the amount of land they own as private property. The amount of total land in European Russia, including peasant allotment land and privately owned land, has been calculated at about 240 million desiatines, except the state lands, of which we shall speak separately. Out of this total of 240 million, 131 million desiatines of allotment land are held by the peasants, that is to say, by over 10 million households, whereas 109 million desiatines are held by private owners, i.e., by less than half of a million families. Thus, even if we take the average, every peasant family holds 13 desiatines, while every family of private owners owns 218 desiatines. But the distribution of the land is much more unequal, as we shall presently see. There's a footnote there on desiatines. These and all subsequent figures concerning the amount of land are very much out of date. They refer to the years 1877 to 78, but we have no more up-to-date figures. The Russian government can only survive by keeping things in the dark, and that is why complete and truthful information about the life of the people throughout our country is so rarely collected, and a desiatine equals 2.7 acres. Now back to the main text. Of the 109 million desiatines owned by private owners, 7 million are royal demesnes, in other words, the private property of the members of the imperial family. The Tsar, with his family, is the first landlord, the biggest landowner in Russia. One family possesses more than 500,000 peasant families. Further, the churches and monasteries own about 6 million desiatines of land. Our priests preach frugality and abstinence to the peasants, but they themselves have, by fair means and foul, accumulated an enormous amount of land. Further, about 2 million desiatines are owned by the cities and towns, and an equal amount by various commercial and industrial companies and corporations. 92 million desiatines, the exact figure is 91,605,845, but to simplify matters, we will quote round figures, belong to less than 500,000, 481,358 families of private owners. Half these families are quite small owners, owning less than 10 desiatines of land each, and all of them together own less than 1 million. On the other hand, 16,000 families own over 1,000 desiatines each, and the total land owned by them amounts to 65 million desiatines. What vast areas of land are concentrated in the hands of the big landowners is also to be seen in the fact that just under 1,000 families, 924, own more than 10,000 desiatines each, and altogether they own 27 million desiatines. 1,000 families own as much land as is owned by 2 million peasant families. Obviously, millions and tens of millions of people are bound to live in poverty and starvation, and will go on living in poverty and starvation as long as such vast areas of land are owned by a few thousand of the rich. Obviously, state authorities, the government itself, even the Tsar's government, will always dance to the tune of these big landowners. Obviously, the rural poor can expect no help from anyone or from any quarter until they unite, combined in a single class, to wage a stubborn, desperate struggle against the landlord class. At this point, we must observe that very many people in this country, including even many people of education, have a totally wrong idea about the strength of the landlord class. They say that the state owns much more land. These bad counselors of the peasants say a large portion of the territory, i.e. of all the land of Russia, already belongs to the state. These words are taken from the newspaper Revolutionная Rossiya, number 8. The mistake these people make arises from the following. They have heard that the state owns 150 million desiatines of land in European Russia. That is true. But they forget that these 150 million desiatines consist almost entirely of uncultivable land and forests in the far north, in the Archangel, Vologda, Olonets, Vyatka, and Perm gubernias. Thus, the state has retained only that land which up to the present has been quite unfit for cultivation, the cultivable land, owned by the state amounts to less than 4 million desiatines. And these cultivable state lands, for example in Samara gubernia, where they are particularly extensive, are leased for very low rents, for next to nothing, to the rich. The rich lease thousands and tens of thousands of desiatines of these lands, and then sublet them to the peasants at exorbitant rents. The people who say that the state owns a great deal of land are very bad counselors of the peasant. The actual case is that the big private landowners, including the Tsar personally, own a lot of good land, and the state itself is in the hands of these big landowners. As long as the rural poor fail to unite, and by uniting become a formidable force, the state will always remain the obedient servant of the landlord class. There is another thing that must not be forgotten. Formerly, almost all the landlords were nobles. The nobility still owns a vast amount of land. In 1877 to 78, 115,000 nobles owned 73 million desiatines. But today, money, capital, has become the ruling power. Merchants and well-to-do peasants have bought very large amounts of land. It is estimated that in the course of 30 years, from 1863 to 1892, the nobility lost, i.e. sold more than they bought, land to the value of over 600 million rubles. And merchants and honorary citizens have acquired land to the value of 250 million rubles. Peasants, Cossacks, and, quote, other rural inhabitants, as our government calls the common folk, to distinguish them from the gentry, or the, quote, clean public, have acquired land to the value of 300 million rubles. Thus, on the average, every year, the peasants in the whole of Russia acquire land as private property to the value of 10 million rubles. And so, there are different sorts of peasants. Some live in poverty and starvation, others grow rich. Consequently, the number of rich peasants who incline toward the landlords and will take the side of the rich against the workers is increasing. The rural poor who want to unite with the urban workers must carefully ponder over this and find out whether there are many rich peasants of this kind, how strong they are, and what kind of a union we need to fight this force. We have just mentioned the bad counselors of the peasant. Those bad counselors are fond of saying that the peasants already have such a union. That union is the Mir, the village commune. The Mir, they say, is a great force. The Mir unites the peasants very closely. The organization, i.e. the association or unity, of the peasants in the Mir is colossal. That is wrong. It is a tale invented by kind-hearted people, but a tale nevertheless. If we listen to tales, we shall only wreck our cause, the cause of uniting the rural poor with the urban workers. Let every rural inhabitant look round carefully. Is the unity of the Mir, is the peasant commune, at all like a union of the poor to fight all the rich, all those who live on the labor of others? No, it is not, and it cannot be. In every village, in every commune, there are many farm laborers, many impoverished peasants, and there are rich peasants who employ farm laborers and buy land, quote, in perpetuity. These rich peasants are also members of the commune, and it is they who lord it in the commune because they are a force. But do we need a union to which the rich belong, and which is lorded over by the rich? Of course not. We need a union to fight the rich. And so, the unity of the Mir is no good to us at all. What we need is a voluntary union, a union only of people who have realized that they must unite with the urban workers. The village commune, however, is not a voluntary union. It is enforced by the state. The village commune does not consist of people who work for the rich and who want to unite to fight the rich. The village commune consists of all sorts of people, not because they want to be in it, but because their parents lived on the same land and worked for the same landlord, because the authorities have registered them as members of that commune. The poor peasant is not free to leave the commune. They're not free to accept in the commune a man whom the police have registered in another bolos, but whom we may need for our union in a particular village. No, we need a very different kind of union, a voluntary union consisting only of laborers and poor peasants to fight all those who live on the labor of others. A quick comment here, I hate to interrupt Lenin, but please take note, Lenin is saying repeatedly, the rich, including the peasants who are getting rich over others. This is not a left-right unity alliance, as people keep insisting today in 2021 in the United States. That is wanton opportunism. Lenin is talking about a a union of all to fight the rich, to fight all the rich, including the rich peasants. This is not left-right unity. Please take note. It is not libertarians who want more capitalism. Please take note. It is the union of peasants to unite with the urban workers to fight all the rich. That is a quote. Okay, back to the text. The times when the mere was a force have long passed, never to return. The mere was a force when hardly any of the peasants were farm laborers or workers wandering over the length and breadth of Russia in search of a job, when there were hardly any rich peasants, when all were equally ground down by the feudal landlords. But now money has become the principal power. Members of the same commune will now fight one another for money like wild beasts. The moneyed peasants sometimes oppress and fleece their fellow peasants more than the landlords do. What we need today is not the unity of the mere, but a union against the power of money, against the rule of capital, a union of all the rural laborers and of all the poor peasants of different communes, a union of all the rural poor with the urban workers to fight both the landlords and the rich peasants. We have seen how strong the landlords are. We must now see whether there are many rich peasants and how strong they are. We estimate the strength of the landlords by the size of their estates, by the amount of land they own. The landlords are free to dispose of their land, free to buy land and to sell it. That is why it is possible to judge their strength very accurately by the amount of land they own. The peasants, however, still lack the right freely to dispose of their land. They are still semi-serfs tied to their village commune. Hence, the strength of the rich peasants cannot be judged by the amount of allotment land they hold. The rich peasants do not grow rich on their allotments. They buy a considerable amount of land, buying both in perpetuity, i.e. as their private property, and for a number of years, i.e. on lease. They buy both from the landlords and from their fellow peasants, from those peasants who leave the land or are compelled by want to let their holdings. It will therefore be more correct to divide the rich, middle, and poor peasants according to the number of horses they own. A peasant who owns many horses will nearly always be a rich peasant. If he keeps many draft animals, it shows that he cultivates a lot of land, owns land besides his communal allotment, and has money saved up. Moreover, we are in a position to calculate the number of peasants owning many horses in the whole of Russia, European Russia, exclusive of Siberia and the Caucasus. Of course, it must not be forgotten that we can speak of the whole of Russia only in averages. The different uzeds and gubernias vary to a significant degree. For instance, in the neighborhood of cities, we often find rich peasant farmers who keep very few horses. Some of them engage in market gardening, a profitable business. Others keep few horses, but many cows, and sell milk. In all parts of Russia, there are also peasants who do not make money out of the land, but engage in trade. They run creameries, hulling mills, and other enterprises. Everybody who lives in the country very well knows of rich peasants in his own village or district. But we want to know how many there are in the whole of Russia and how strong they are, so that the poor peasant shall not have to guess and go about blindfold, as it were, but know exactly his friends and his foes. Well then, let us see whether there are many peasants who are rich or poor in horses. We have already said that the total number of peasant households in Russia is estimated at about 10 million. Between them, they now own probably about 15 million horses. About 14 years ago, the number was 17 million, but it is smaller now. Thus, on the average, every 10 households have 15 horses. But the whole point is that some of them, a few, own many horses, while others, very many, own no horses or very few. There are at least 3 million peasants who own no horses, and about 3.5 million own one horse each. All these are utterly ruined, or very poor peasants. We call these the rural poor. They number 6.5 million out of a total of 10 million. That is to say, almost 2/3. Next come the middle peasants, who own a pair of draft animals each. These peasants also number about 2 million households, owning about 4 million horses. Then come the rich peasants, each of whom owns more than a pair of draft animals. Such comprise 1.5 million households, but they own 7.5 million horses. Thus, about 1/6 of the total households own half the total number of horses. Now that we know this, we are in a position to judge fairly accurately the strength of the rich peasants. In number, they are very few. In the different communes and volosts, they will comprise 10 to 20 households in every 100. But these few households are the richest. Taking Russia as a whole, they own almost as many horses as all the other peasants taken together. That means that their land under crops must also amount to nearly half the total area sown to crops by the peasants. Such peasants harvest much more grain than they require for their families. They sell large quantities of grain. They grow grain not merely to feed themselves, but grow it chiefly for sale to make money. Peasants like these can save money. They deposit it in savings banks and banks. They buy land as property. We've already said how much land the peasants all over Russia buy every year. Nearly all this land goes to these few rich peasants. The rural poor have to think not of buying land, but of getting enough to eat. Often they have not enough money to buy grain, let alone land. Therefore, the banks in general, and the peasants' bank in particular, do not help all peasants to buy land, as is sometimes asserted by people who try to deceive the mujik or by the very simple-minded. But only an insignificant number of peasants, only the rich peasants. Therefore, the peasants' evil counselors, whom we have mentioned, tell an untruth when they say that the land is being bought by the peasants, that it is passing from capital to labor. The land can never pass to labor, that is, to the poor working man, because land has to be paid for with money. But the poor never have any money to spare. The land can only go to the rich, moneyed peasants, to capital, to those people against whom the rural poor must fight in alliance with the urban workers. The rich peasants not only buy land in perpetuity, most often they take land for a number of years on a lease. By renting large plots, they prevent the rural poor from getting land. For example, it has been calculated how much land rich peasants have rented in a single uzed, Konstantinograd, in Poltava gubernia. And what do we find? The number who rented 30 desiatines or more per household is very small, only 2 out of every 15 households. But these rich peasants have gained possession of 1/2 of all the rented land, and each of them has on the average 75 desiatines of the rented land. Or take Taurida gubernia, where a calculation has been made of how much of the land rented by the peasants from the state through the mir, through the village commune, has been grabbed by the rich. It has been found that the rich, who account for only 1/5 of the total number of households, have grabbed 3/4 of the rented land. Everywhere, land goes to those who have money, and only the few rich have money. Further, much land is now let by the peasants themselves. The peasants abandon their holdings because they have no livestock, no seed, nothing with which to run their farms. Today, even land is of no use unless you have money. For instance, in Duvozensk Uzed in Samaria gubernia, 1, sometimes even 2 out of every 3 rich peasant households rent allotment land in their own or in another commune. The allotments are let by those who have no horses or only 1 horse. In Taurida gubernia, as much as 1/3 of all peasant households let their allotments. 1/4 of the peasant allotments, 250,000 desiatines, are let. Of this 250,000 desiatines, 150,000 desiatines, 3/5, are rented by rich peasants. This too shows whether the unity of the mir, the commune, is of any use to the poor. In the village commune, he who has money has power. What we need is the unity of the poor of all communes. Just as with land purchase, the peasants are deceived by talk about buying cheap plows, harvesters, and all sorts of improved implements. Zemstvo stores and artels are set up, and it is said improved implements will better the conditions of the peasantry. That is mere deception. All these improved implements always go to the rich. The poor get next to nothing. They cannot think of buying plows and harvesters. They have enough to do to keep body and soul together. All this sort of helping the peasants is nothing but helping the rich. As for the mass of the poor, who have neither land, livestock, nor reserves, they will not benefit by the fact that the better implements will be cheaper. Here is an example. In an uyezd in Samara gubernia, all the improved implements belonging to the poor and to the rich peasants have been taken stock of. It was found that 1/5 of all the households, i.e. the most well-to-do, owned almost 3/4 of the improved implements, while the poor, half the households, had only 1/30. Out of a total of 28,000 households, 10,000 possessed one horse each or none. These 10,000 had only 7 improved implements out of a total of 5,724 improved implements owned by all the peasant households in the UES. 7 out of 5,724. That is the share of the rural poor in all these farm improvements, in all this increase in the number of plows and harvesters, which are supposed to help, quote, all the peasantry. That is what the rural poor must expect from those who talk about, quote, improving peasant farming. Finally, one of the main features of the rich peasants is that they hire farmhands and day laborers. Like the landlords, the rich peasants also live on the labor of others. Like the landlords, they grow rich because the mass of the peasants are ruined and pauperized. Like the landlords, they try to squeeze as much work as they can out of their farmhands, and to pay them as little as possible. If millions of peasants were not utterly ruined and compelled to go to work for others, become hired laborers, sell their labor power, the rich peasants could not exist, could not carry on their farms. There would be no abandoned allotments for them to pick up and no laborers for them to hire. The 1.5 million rich peasants throughout Russia certainly hire no less than 1 million farmhands and day laborers. Obviously, in the great struggle between the propertied class and the class of the propertyless, between masters and workers, between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the rich peasants will take the side of the property owners against the working class. We now know the position and the strength of the rich peasantry. Let us examine the conditions of the rural poor. We have already said that the rural poor comprise the vast majority, almost 2/3, of the peasant households throughout Russia. To begin with, the number of households without horses cannot be less than 3 million, probably more than that today, perhaps 3.5 million. Every famine year, every crop failure ruins tens of thousands of farms. The population grows, life on the land becomes more crowded, but all the best land has been grabbed by the landlords and the rich peasants. And so, every year, more and more people are ruined, go to the towns and the factories, take work as farmhands, or become unskilled laborers. A peasant who has no horse is one who has become quite poor. He is a proletarian. He gains a living. If you can call it a living, it would be truer to say that he just contrives to keep body and soul together. Not from the land, not from his farm, but by working for hire. He is brother to the town worker. Even land is of no use to the peasant without a horse. Half the households without horses let their allotments, while some even surrender them to the commune for nothing, sometimes even pay the difference between the taxes and the expected income from the land, because they are not in a position to till their land. A peasant who has no horse sows 1 desiatine, or 2 at the most. He always has to buy additional grain, if he has the money to buy it with. His own crop will never suffice to feed him. Peasants who own 1 horse each, and there are about 3.5 million such households throughout Russia, are not very much better off. Of course, there are exceptions. We've already said that, here and there. There are peasants with 1 horse each who are doing middling well, or are even rich. But we are not speaking of exceptions, of individual localities, but of Russia as a whole. If we take the entire mass of peasants who have 1 horse each, there can be no doubt that they are a mass of paupers. Even in the agricultural gubernias, the peasant who has 1 horse sows only 3 or 4 desiatines, rarely 5. His crop does not suffice either. Even in a good year, his food is no better than that of a peasant without a horse, which means that he is always underfed, always starves. His farm is in decay, his livestock is poor and short of fodder, and he is not in a position to look after his land properly. The peasant who owns 1 horse, in Voronezh gubernia, for example, can afford to spend, not accounting expenditure on fodder, not more than 20 rubles a year on the whole of his farm. A rich peasant spends 10 times as much. 20 rubles a year for rent, to buy livestock, repair his wooden plow and other implements, pay the shepherd, and for everything else. Do you call that farming? It is sheer misery, hard labor, endless drudgery. It is natural that some of the peasants with 1 horse each, and not a few, should also let their allotments. Even land is of little use to a pauper. He has no money, and his land does not even provide him with enough to eat, let alone with money. But money is needed for everything, for food, for clothing, for the farm, and to pay taxes. In Voronezh gubernia, a peasant who owns one horse usually has to pay about 18 rubles a year in taxes alone, while he cannot make more than 75 rubles a year to meet all his expenses. Under these circumstances, it is sheer mockery to talk about buying land, about improved implements, about agricultural banks. These things were not invented for the poor. Where is the peasant to get the money from? He has to look for earnings on the side. A peasant who owns one horse, like the peasant who owns none, ekes out a living only with the help of earnings. But what does earnings mean? It means working for others, working for hire. It means that the peasant who owns one horse has ceased to be an independent farmer and has become a hireling, a proletarian. That is why such peasants are called semi-proletarians. They too are brothers to the town workers because they too are fleeced in every way by all sorts of employers. They too have no way out, no salvation, except by uniting with the Social Democrats to fight all the rich, all the property owners. Who works on the building of railways? Who is fleeced by the contractors? Who goes out lumbering and timber floating? Who works as farmhand or as day laborer? Who does the unskilled work in the towns and ports? It is always the rural poor, the peasants who have no horses or only one each. It is always the rural proletarians and semi-proletarians. And what vast numbers of these there are in Russia. It has been calculated that throughout Russia, exclusive of the Caucasus and Siberia, 8 and sometimes even 9 million passports are taken out yearly. Those are all for migratory workers. They are peasants only in name. Actually, they are hirelings, wage laborers. They must all unite in one union with the town workers, and every ray of light and knowledge that reaches the countryside will strengthen and consolidate this unity. There's one more point about earnings that must not be forgotten. All kinds of officials and people who think as the officials do are fond of saying that the peasant, the mujik, needs two things: land, but not very much of it, besides he can't get much because the rich have grabbed it all, and earnings. Therefore, they say in order to help the people, it is necessary to introduce more trades in the rural districts, to, quote, provide more earnings. Such talk is sheer hypocrisy. For the poor, earnings means wage labor. To provide earnings for the peasant means transforming him into a wage laborer. Fine sort of assistance that is. For the rich peasants, there are other kinds of earnings, which require capital. For instance, the building of a flour mill, or some other plant, the purchase of threshing machines, trade, and so on. To confuse the earnings of moneyed people with the wage labor of the poor means deceiving the poor. Of course, this deception is to the advantage of the rich. It is to their advantage to make it appear that all kinds of earnings are open to and within the reach of all the peasants. But he who really cares for the welfare of the poor will tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. It remains for us to consider the middle peasants. We've already seen that, on the average, taking Russia as a whole, we must regard as a middle peasant, one who has a pair of draft animals, and that out of a total of 10 million households, there are about 2 million middle peasant households in the country. The middle peasant stands between the rich peasant and the proletarian, and that is why he's called a middle peasant. His standard of living, too, is middling. In a good year, he makes ends meet on his farm, but poverty is always knocking at the door. He has either very few savings or none at all. That is why his farm is in a precarious position. He finds it hard to get money. Only very seldom can he make as much money out of his farm as he needs. And if he does, it is just barely enough. To go out for earnings would mean neglecting the farm, and everything would go to rack and ruin. Nevertheless, many of the middle peasants cannot get along without earnings. They too have to hire themselves to others. Want compels them to go into bondage to the landlord, to fall into debt. And once in debt, the middle peasant is hardly ever able to get out of it, for unlike the rich peasant, he has no steady income. Therefore, once he falls into debt, it is as if he had put his neck in a halter. He remains a debtor until he is utterly ruined. It is chiefly the middle peasant who falls into bondage to the landlord, because for work paid on a job basis, the landlord needs a peasant who is not ruined, one who owns a pair of horses and all implements required in farming. It is not easy for the middle peasant to go elsewhere in search of earnings, so he goes into bondage to the landlord in return for grain, permission to use pasture land, the lease of the cut-off lands, and money advances during the winter. The middle peasant is hard-pressed, not only by the landlord and the kulak, but also by his rich neighbor, who is always one jump ahead when he wants to acquire more land, and never misses an opportunity to squeeze him in one way or another. Such is the life of the middle peasant. He's neither fish nor fowl. He can neither be a real master nor a worker. All the middle peasants strive to become masters. They want to be property owners, but very few succeed. There are a very few, who even hire farmhands or day laborers, try to become rich on the labor of others, to rise to wealth on the backs of others. But most middle peasants have no money to hire laborers. In fact, they have to hire themselves out. Wherever a struggle begins between the rich and the poor, between the property owners and the workers, the middle peasant remains in between, not knowing which side to take. The rich call him to their side. You too are a master, a man of property. They say to him, you have nothing to do with the penniless workers. But the workers say, the rich will cheat and fleece you, and there is no other salvation for you but to help us in our fight against all the rich. This struggle for the middle peasant is going on everywhere, in all countries, wherever the social democratic workers are fighting to emancipate the working people. In Russia, the struggle is just beginning. That is why we must most carefully study the matter and understand clearly the deceits the rich resort to in order to win over the middle peasant. We must learn how to expose these deceits and help the middle peasant to find his real friends. If the Russian social democratic workers at once take the right road, we shall establish a firm alliance between the rural workers and the urban workers more quickly than our comrades, the German workers, and we shall speedily achieve victory over all the enemies of the working people. That is the end of section 3. Moving on to section 4, what path should the middle peasant take? Should he take the side of the property owners and the rich, or the side of the workers and the poor? All property owners, the entire bourgeoisie, try to win over the middle peasant by promising him all sorts of ways to improve his farm. Cheap plows, agricultural banks, the introduction of grass sowing, cheap livestock and fertilizers, and so on, and also by inducing the peasant to join all sorts of agricultural societies, cooperatives, as they are called in books, which unite all kinds of farmers with the object of improving farming methods. In this way, the bourgeoisie try to keep the middle, and even the small peasant, even the semi-proletarian, from uniting with the workers, and try to induce them to side with the rich, the bourgeoisie, in their fight against the workers, the proletariat. To this, the social democratic workers reply, improved farming is an excellent thing. There is no harm in buying cheaper plows. Nowadays, even a merchant, if he's not a fool, tries to sell more cheaply to attract customers. But when a poor or a middle peasant is told that improved farming and cheaper plows will help all of them to escape from poverty and to get on their feet without touching the rich, this is deception. All these improvements, lower prices and cooperatives, societies for the sale and purchase of goods, benefit the rich far more than anybody else. The rich grow stronger and oppress the poor and middle peasants more and more. As long as the rich remain rich, as long as they own most of the land, livestock, implements, and money, as long as all this lasts, not only the poor, but even the middle peasants will never be able to escape from want.
Same time tomorrow. Please like, share, and subscribe.